2,000 years ago, at the dawn of the first century, the world was ruled from Rome, and Rome was in turmoil. Civil war had engulfed the empire's capital city. Dictators seized power, and the Roman future seemed bleak. But from the chaos, the Roman Empire would rise stronger and more dazzling than ever before. Within a few short years, it would stretch from Britain across Europe to southern Egypt, from North Africa around the Mediterranean to the Middle East. It would embrace hundreds of languages and religions, and would till those diverse cultures into a rich soil from which Western civilization would grow. Rome would become the world's first and most enduring superpower, spanning continents and epochs. The glory days of Rome were studded with names that reach out to us across 2 millennia: Ovid and Nero, Seneca and Caligula. But the story of Rome is more than the story of famous men, and millions of less familiar figures struck different chords in the symphony of empire. People such as the wealthy benefactor, Eumacia, the rebel queen, Boudica, and countless uncelebrated soldiers and slaves, senators and peasants. And above them all, this man, Caesar Augustus. This was the emperor who set the tone for the astonishing resonance of Rome. This series tells the story of Augustus and his people, the men and women who wrested order from chaos, shaped the greatest empire the world had ever seen, and launched the Roman Empire in the 1st century. "2,000 years after Egypt's pharaohs reigned supreme, 400 years after the flowering of Greek culture, 300 years after Alexander the Great, a boy named Octavian was born in a small Italian town. The child would one day be called Augustus, and his birth, one ancient historian tells us, would be gilded by legend.
His father, leading an army through distant lands, went to a sacred grove, seeking prophecy on the boy's future. When wine was poured on the altar, flames shot up to heaven, a sign seen only once before by Alexander the Great. The priest declared that Augustus would be ruler of the world.
The story is told by Suetonius. Writing at the turn of the 1st century, he based his biography on eyewitness accounts, on common gossip, and on research conducted as imperial librarian. In truth, he writes, the prospects of young Augustus were far from grand. The boy was sickly, with few connections. His family were country people. His father, the first in their line to join the Senate. But worse, Augustus was born into dangerous times. Civil war had flared for decades. Feuding nobles, many controlling large armies, fought to gain power for themselves. And Rome's traditions of open government were often trampled underfoot. So too were innocent bystanders. When Augustus was just 4 years old, his father suddenly died. Without a male mentor, the boy's future looked bleak. But in 49 BC, when he was 13, Augustus's fortune took a dramatic turn. For in that year, his great-uncle, Julius Caesar, gained the upper hand on the battlefield. Leading an army across the Rubicon River, Caesar declared himself master of Rome and ruler of an empire still aspiring to greatness.
At the time of Julius Caesar, the Roman Empire was a little bit like a boy who's reached 6 feet tall, and yet he's only 14 or 15 years old. He's not yet a man. The externals of empire were there. The armies were there. The Romans governed most of the coast of the Mediterranean, with the exception of Egypt. However, they had not yet learned to bring that into a functioning organism.
The past decades of internal fighting had weakened the empire. Northern tribes harried the borders. Enemies were confronting Rome in the east, and the province of Spain threatened to break free. Julius Caesar moved quickly to bolster the frontiers and his own legacy. Caesar had no heir, so when Augustus completed a dangerous mission, Caesar adopted the teenager in his will.
Augustus realized here was a tremendous opportunity. Mind you, he had no military training, but he was the heir of the greatest political figure that was on the Roman sky literally at that time, and he cashed in on it.
It was a heady opportunity for Augustus, but also a perilous challenge. For in 44 BC, foreigners were not the only threat to stability. There were enemies within Caesar's small circle of advisors. They murdered Caesar at a meeting of the Senate. For the second time in his life, Augustus lost a father. But now on the verge of manhood, he thrust himself into the maelstrom of Roman politics.
The death of Julius Caesar was not just a turning point in Augustus's life, it was a turning point in world history. He was extremely young at this time, only in his 19th year. And yet, when he knew that he had been made Caesar's heir, he immediately took up the political legacy of Caesar and entered the mainstream of Roman politics, didn't hesitate to try to avenge his father, but that meant, of course, stepping onto the stage of politics, raising an army, and immediately immersing himself in a contest for supreme political power at Rome.
He displayed brutality against enemy prisoners. Once, when a father and son were begging for their lives, he ordered they should draw lots to determine which would be executed. The father offered himself, and so was killed. Because of this, the son committed suicide. Augustus watched them both die.
Suetonius describes the crisis as trial by fire, and Augustus didn't flinch from the task. He formed a strategic alliance with Mark Antony, a powerful general who also wanted supremacy. Together, they massacred their enemies in the capital. Then they pursued their rivals to the shores of Greece, where they fought and won two of the bloodiest battles in Roman history. When the carnage ended, the empire was theirs. Augustus and Antony divided the spoils of war. Augustus remained in Rome, but Antony took control of Egypt, a land not formally joined to Rome, but firmly under the empire's command. There he joined forces with Egypt's queen. Ancient historians, like Cassius Dio, believed that was a fateful move. When Antony fell deeply in love with his new ally, many feared the ambitious queen was scheming to rule Rome herself. Her name was Cleopatra.
Cleopatra's brazen desire for passion and wealth was insatiable. By love, she had made herself Queen of Egypt. But she failed in her goal to become Queen of the Romans.
Cleopatra did not enjoy a good press in Rome. What really irritated people about Cleopatra is that she was a powerful woman from the East and from a very wealthy country with a monarchic system of government. And she therefore symbolized lack of moderation, lack of control, frenzy, fury, everything that Rome tried not to be. Cleopatra and Antony were cast as the leaders of the evil empire.
Antony's alliance with Augustus withered. He and Cleopatra mobilized, but Augustus struck first. The poet Virgil later cast the battle as an epic struggle of East against West.
Standing high on the stern, Augustus leads the Italians into battle, carrying with him the might of the Senate and the people. Opposing him with barbarian wealth is Antony, suited for battle. He carries with him the powers of the Orient, and, to the scandal of all, his Egyptian wife. Their monstrous divinities raise weapons against our noble Roman gods.
Three-quarters of the Egyptian fleet was destroyed. Antony and Cleopatra committed suicide, and the land of the pharaohs was formally annexed to the Roman Empire.
The annexation of Egypt for Augustus was immensely important. It was the equivalent of Hitler's troops marching through the streets of Paris. Here was a wealthy country that was going to be providing food, that was going to be providing land, but above all, it was a country of great cultural prestige. And once Rome had Egypt as part of its empire, they had truly arrived.
There is nothing that men can wish from the gods, nothing the gods can do for men which Augustus, when he returned to the city, did not do for the Republic, the Roman people, and the entire world. Civil wars were finished, foreign wars ended, and everywhere the fury of arms was put to rest.
Upon Augustus's return to a war-torn Rome in 29 BC, the city went wild with enthusiasm. The triumphant general vowed to restore peace and security. It was a promise he would keep. The victory of Augustus launched a period of stunning cultural vitality, of religious renewal, and of economic well-being that spread throughout the empire. It would be called the Pax Romana, the Peace of Rome. And to many, it marked the return of Rome's mythic and glorious past. But Augustus himself would never return to the past. He was now a hardened 32-year-old man, the sole ruler of the Greco-Roman world, Rome's first emperor. Victory had been costly, but the greatest challenge still lay ahead. For to avoid the fate of Julius Caesar, Augustus must disarm the Senate and charm the masses. He must do better than win the war. He must win the peace. That challenge would occupy the rest of his life.
Let me step forward, clear my throat, and announce that I am a native of Solmo, a few days' journey eastward from Rome.
While Augustus fought his way to the pinnacle of power, a boy named Ovid was coming of age under less demanding circumstances.
I was the second son, a year to the day younger than my brother. We always had 2 cakes on the birthday we shared, and were close in other ways as well. We studied together, and then went up to Rome to seek our fortunes. I used to waste my time trying to write verses. Our father called it waste. He disapproved of any pursuit where you couldn't earn a decent living, and always used to say, Homer died poor.
Ovid came from the same stock as Augustus. They were both landed gentry, and like Augustus, the young man found his identity and his ambitions molded by his demanding family.
I tried to give up poetry, to stick to prose on serious subjects, but frivolous minds like mine attract frivolous inspirations, some too good not to fool with. I kept returning to my bad habits, secretive and ashamed. I couldn't help it. I felt like an imposter at serious matters, but I owed it to my father and brother to try to do my duty.
By Roman law, a father wielded absolute control over his children. Those who displeased him could be disowned, sold into slavery, or even killed. The young Ovid tried to meet his father's expectations. He married, he studied law, but the strain proved unendurable. Miserable, Ovid and a friend set out on a journey of self-discovery.
We toured all the magnificent cities of Asia. We watched the flames of Mount Etna light up the heavens. We plowed the waves in a painted ship and also traveled by wagon. Often the road seemed short as we were lost in conversation. When we walked, our words outnumbered our steps, and we had too much to say, even for the long evenings of summer.
18 months later, Ovid settled in Rome, older and more self-confident than before. He resolved to become a poet. He cultivated new friends in Roman literary circles, and soon Ovid made a name for himself as Rome's reigning poet of stolen kisses.
So your husband is coming to this dinner party. I hope he gags on his food. Listen, and learn what you must do. When he settles on his couch to eat, go to him with a straight face. Look modest and lie back beside him, but secretly touch me with your foot. Don't let him drape his arms around your neck. Don't rest your gentle head against his chest. Don't welcome his fingers to your lap or to your eager nipples. Most of all, no kissing. When dinner is done, your husband will close the bedroom door. But whatever the night shall bring, tell me tomorrow you refused him.
It's a mistake to think that Ovid's poetry can be read very literally in purely autobiographical terms. That wouldn't be true, I think, of any poetry from antiquity. But clearly at the same time, Ovid is writing about subjects of which he has some sort of experience, and he certainly, through the love poetry, opens up a world which is very different in tone and quality from the official atmosphere.
While Ovid bloomed as a man of words, the new emperor thrived as a man of action. He rebuilt Rome and his own family. Divorcing his wife, Augustus married his heavily pregnant mistress, Livia. The move raised eyebrows and hackles, for love was not the only motive, and although Augustus shunned the trappings of absolute power, many suspected he was building a dynasty, a line of heirs to rule Rome for generations to come. Augustus knew it was a dangerous move. The Julius Caesar had been murdered for appearing a king. Augustus would not make the same mistake. He relinquished high office and struck a delicate balance between fact and fiction.
Having by universal consent acquired control of all affairs, I transferred government to the Senate and the people of Rome.
Augustus was a very cagey political leader because he pretended to be restoring all of these Republican political traditions, and in fact, what he was running was a full-fledged dynastic monarchy.
Augustus conquered Cantabria, Aquitania, Pannonia, Dalmatia, and all of Illyricum, as well as Rhaetia.
Augustus not only changed the empire, he expanded it. Egypt had been added early in his career. Soon, northern Spain was joined. Augustus drove across Europe, into Germany, and he united East and West by adding modern Hungary, Austria, the Balkans, and central Turkey. These victories employed Roman soldiers and senators and offered welcome distractions to the city's poor. When Augustus wasn't staging chariot races or gladiator shows, he displayed exotic animals, the quarry of Rome's far-flung empire. A rhinoceros appeared in the arena, Asian tigers in the theater, a giant serpent in the forum.
One key constituency for Augustus was the plebeian population of Rome. That is basically the city mob. You have several 100,000 folks here who have no jobs, and to put it very simply, who need to be kept off the streets and be kept from making trouble, because it's a very volatile and combustible mix there.
The volatile mix that made up Rome stayed quiet for the first 4 years of Augustus's rule. Then, in 23 BC, events took a critical turn. Cassius Dio writes that a series of disasters convinced the people that Augustus needed not less power, but more.
The city was flooded by the overflowing river, and many things were struck by lightning. Then a plague passed through Italy, and no one could work the land. The Romans thought these misfortunes were caused because Augustus had relinquished his office. They wished to appoint him dictator. A mob barricaded the Senate inside its building and, threatening to burn them alive, forced the Senate to vote Augustus absolute ruler.
The demands threatened to unsettle the emperor's precarious political balance. Augustus fell to his knees before the rioters. He tore his toga and beat his chest. He promised the mob that he would personally take control of the grain supply. But Augustus refused to be called a dictator. The crowd disbanded, but the lesson was clear. Augustus was riding a tiger. To keep order on the frontiers, the streets, and the Senate was a superhuman task, and superhuman skills were needed. Luckily for Rome, Augustus had them.
Then something very fortuitous happens. Halley's Comet shows up. And the word is given out by Augustus. This is the soul of Julius Caesar ascending into heaven. So from this point on, he is called Julius Caesar the Divine. Politically, it became very potent, because what does Augustus do at this point? On all his coinage, on all his writings, and all his symbols, whatever, he puts out the words DF, Son of the Divine. And it's really quite an asset in politics to be the son of the divine. There are modern politicians, I think, would be very jealous of being able to do that.
Augustus enhanced his pious new identity with stories of his lean habits. It was said that he lived in a modest house and slept on a low bed, that he ate common foods, coarse bread, common cheese, and sometimes even less.
My dear Tiberius, not even a Jew observes a fast as diligently on the Sabbath as I have today. I ate nothing until the early hours of evening, when I nibbled 2 bites before my rub-down.
Moral change, Augustus began to argue, was the enemy of Rome. He believed that its future ran through its past, through the restoration of values he thought had first made Rome great.
I renewed many traditions which were fading in our age. I restored 82 temples of the gods, neglecting none that required repair at the time.
In public, Augustus led by example. He sacrificed animals in traditional rituals, and he re-established traditional social rules. New laws assigned theater seats by social rank. Women were confined to the back rows. Adultery was outlawed. Marriage and children encouraged. To many, Roman society had recovered its true course. The son of a god was building an empire for the ages.
Who can find words to adequately describe the advancements of these years? Authority has been returned to the government, majesty to the Senate, and influence to the courts. Protests in the theater have been stopped. Integrity is honored. Depravity is punished.
But amid the applause, there were also cries of protest. The emperor's new traditionalism rankled friends and enemies alike. It even rankled his own daughter, Julia. Long a pawn of family politics, Julia assumed that she was exempt from her father's stringent views. She was wrong. And in the coming years, Augustus, the son of a god, would have to confront Augustus, the father.
If there is anyone here who is a novice in the art of love, let him read my book. With study, he will love like a professional.
As the Emperor Augustus firmly charted a course of moral rigor, the poet Ovid staked out different ground. He was now Rome's most famous living poet, and his boldness grew in step with his reputation. Having all but exhausted the conventions of love poetry, he decided to stretch them. He began composing a manual of practical tips on adultery.
Step 1. Stroll under a shady colonnade. Don't miss the shrine of Adonis, but the theater is your best hunting ground. There you'll find women to satisfy any desire. Just as ants come and go, so the cultured ladies swarm to the games. They come for the show, and to make a show of themselves. There are so many, I often reel from the choice.
Many Romans yearned to follow their emperor back to the good old days of stern Roman virtue, but others reveled in the promises of Rome's newfound peace. Ovid was one of them. To the youthful poet, old limits seemed meaningless.
Do not doubt you can have any girl you wish. Some give in, others resist, but all love to be propositioned. And even if you fail, rejection doesn't hurt. But why should you fail? Women always welcome pleasure and find novelty exciting.
Indeed, the earlier civil wars had unleashed enormous social change. Some women had gained political clout, new rights, and new freedoms. Tradition holds that one such woman was Julia, the emperor's only child.
Julia had a love of letters and was well educated, a given in that family. She also had a gentle nature and no cruel intentions. Together, these brought her great esteem as a woman.
Julia didn't reject traditional values wholesale. She had long endured her father's overbearing control. She dutifully married 3 times to further his dynastic ambitions, and she bore 5 children. Her 2 boys, Gaius and Lucius, were cherished by Augustus as probable heirs. But like Ovid, Julia expected more from the peace. She was clever and vivacious, and she had an irreverent tongue that cut across the grain of Roman convention. Her legendary wit was passed through the centuries by a late Roman writer called Macrobius.
Several times her father ordered her, in a manner both doting and scolding, to moderate her lavish clothes and keep less mischievous company. Once he saw her in a revealing dress. He disapproved, but held his tongue. The next day, in a different dress, she embraced her father with modesty. He could not contain his joy and said, "Now, isn't this dress more suited to the daughter of Augustus?" Julia retorted, "Today I'm dressed for my father's eyes. Yesterday I dressed for my husband's."
But apparently Julia's charms were not reserved for her husband alone. The emperor's daughter took many lovers.
Her dalliances were so well known that people were actually surprised when her children resembled her second husband, who was the father of her 5 children. And she wittily replied, "Well, that's because I never take on a passenger unless I already have a full cargo," meaning that she waited until she was already pregnant before undertaking these dalliances. So concerned was she to protect the bloodlines of these offspring.
Julia, like Ovid, was a testament to her times. But neither of them were average Romans. The life they represented shocked traditional society to the core, and as Julia entered her 38th year, crisis loomed.
In that year, a scandal broke out in the emperor's own home. Shameful to discuss, horrible to remember.
One Roman soldier voiced deep revulsion at Julia's extraordinary self-indulgence.
Julia, ignoring her father Augustus, did everything which is shameful for a woman to do, whether through extravagance or lust. She counted her sins as though counting her blessings, and asserted her freedom to ignore the laws of decency.
Julia's behavior erupted into a full-blown political crisis, and it was marked by overblown claims. The emperor's daughter was rumored to hold nightly revels in Rome's public square. She was said to barter sexual favors from the podium where her father addressed the people. When the gossip reached Augustus, the emperor flew into a violent rage. He refused to see visitors. Upon emerging, Suetonius reports, he publicly denounced his only child.
He wrote a letter advising the Senate of her misbehavior, but was absent when it was read. He secluded himself out of shame and even considered a death sentence for his daughter. He grew more obstinate when the Roman people came to him several times begging for her sake. He cursed the crowd that they should have such daughters and such wives.
As a father, Augustus could not abide Julia's behavior. As an emperor, he could not tolerate the embarrassment. Augustus banished Julia for the rest of her life.
I was going to pass over the ways a clever girl might elude a husband or watchful guard. But since you need help, here's my advice.
Soon after Julia's exile, Ovid released his salacious poem. It couldn't have been more poorly timed.
Of course, a guard stands in your way, but you can still write. Compose love letters while alone in the bathroom and send them out with an accomplice. She can hide them next to her warm flesh, under her dress, or bound beneath her foot. Should your guard get wind of these schemes, she can offer her skin for paper and carry out notes written on her body.
Ovid's poetry extolled behavior for which the emperor's daughter was banished, and her fate loomed large as a warning. For the present, the emperor remained mute toward Rome's most gifted rebel. Ovid turned his hand to less provocative forms of poetry. He remarried, and he embraced a new appreciation for discretion.
Enjoy forbidden pleasures in their place, but when you dress, don't forget your mask of decorum. An innocent face hides more than a lying tongue.
Ovid was on notice. The order of Augustus had firm bounds of propriety, and Ovid had tested them to the fullest.
Now consider the dangers of night. Tiles fall from the rooftop and crack you on the head. And the drunken hooligan, spoiling for a fight, cannot rest without a brawl. What can you do when a raving madman confronts you? Or tenants throw their broken pots out the window? You're courting disaster if you go to dinner before writing your will.
At the turn of the 1st century, the poet Juvenal was writing verses that exposed much of Rome to scorn. He was acerbic and had a keen eye for the gritty realities of urban life.
Our apartment block is a tottering ruin. The building manager props it up with slender poles and plasters over the gaping cracks. Then he bids us sleep safe and sound in his wretched death trap.
I don't think our notion of Rome bears much relation to the Rome of everyday life, because what is left today are the big public buildings, not the squalid hovels, without plumbing and without any kind of sanitary conditions that ordinary people lived in. That's precisely the reason members of the elite preferred to withdraw up onto the hills and have their villas up on the hills, a little bit away from the noise and away from the stench and away from that incredible horde of people pressing close together.
I would love to live where there are no fears in the dark of night. Even now, I smell fire and hear a neighbor cry out for water as he struggles to save his measly belongings. Smoke pours out from the 3rd story as flames move upwards. But the poor wretch who lives at the top, with a leaking roof and roosting birds, is oblivious to the danger and sure to burn.
In the year 4 in the imperial palace, the Emperor Augustus also lost sleep, but not from fear of fire. Now an old man of 66, Augustus had lost much of his youthful vigor.
His vision had faded in his left eye. His teeth were few, widely spaced, and worn down. His hair wispy and yellowed. His skin was irritated by scratching and vehement scraping, so that he had chronic rough spots resembling ringworm.
As the emperor neared death, plots to succeed him sprouted. His grandsons and intended heirs had both died unexpectedly, and the emperor himself lived under constant threat of assassination. Speaking for Augustus, one ancient historian voiced his dilemma. "Whereas solitude is dreadful," he wrote, "company is also dreadful. The very men who protect us are most terrifying."
In many ways, Augustus looks so solid, and what he created looks so solid, you forget the fragility. I think contemporaries were very aware of that fragility, and surely Augustus was. He was over-anxious, in a sense, to provide a secure system after he'd gone.
At this time, there were unusually strong earthquakes. The Tiber pulled down the bridge and flooded the city for 7 days. There was a partial eclipse of the sun, and famine developed.
Ancient historians report that natural disasters predicted political ones, and indeed, the emperor's difficulties seemed to be mounting fast. In the year 6, soldiers, the backbone of the empire, refused to re-enlist without a pay raise. New funds had to be found. Then, fire swept parts of the capital. A reluctant Augustus turned to taxation. It was a dangerous tactic, and the emperor knew it. Fearing a coup, Augustus dispersed potential enemies. He recessed the courts and disbanded the Senate. He even dismissed his own retinue. Still, Rome remained on edge.
The mob, distressed by the famine and the taxes after the fire, were unsettled. They openly discussed rebellion. When night fell, they hung seditious posters.
The crisis passed, but soon a new and even greater disaster battered the aging Augustus. It began in Germany, a land of fiercely independent tribes, and to the Roman eye, rugged barbarism. The region had been recently conquered, and Roman customs were taking root, or so they thought.
The barbarians had not forgotten their ancient traditions, their free way of life, or the power of arms. But as long as they were assimilated slowly, they did not realize they were changing and did not resist Roman influence.
That peaceful evolution stopped, however, in the year 9, the year an arrogant young general called Quintilius Varus became commander of the Rhine army and brought an iron fist to the province.
He forced more drastic change on the barbarians, and among other things, he dealt with them as if they were slaves of the Romans, and exacted money as if they were his subjects.
Varus disastrously miscalculated the extent of Roman control and misjudged German compliance. A trusted German chieftain organized a full-scale revolt and lured Varus's troops into a trap, deep in unfamiliar terrain.
The mountains were rocky and cut with ravines. The trees were dense and tall, so that the Romans were struggling to make progress. Rain began to fall in sheets, and a heavy wind scattered their numbers. The ground became slippery around the tree trunks and roots. While the Romans were dealing with these troubles, the barbarians surrounded them, and suddenly coming from everywhere. First, they hurled missiles from afar. But then, since no one was fighting back and many were wounded, the barbarians came ever closer, and the Romans were unable to retaliate. They kept crashing into each other in the trees. They could not grip their arrows or javelins. The rain forced the weapons from their hands. Even their sodden shields were useless. And so every man and every horse was slaughtered.
Three legions were massacred, a tenth of Rome's army. Augustus, his biographer reports, was traumatized.
They say he was so disturbed that for several months he let his hair and beard grow, and would sometimes bash his head on doors and cry out, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions."
The disaster in Germany underscored a stark reality. The empire was born of violence, and to violence it ever threatened to return. The emperor was in no mood for leniency.
Believe me, love's climax of pleasure should not be rushed, but savored. And when you reach those places your woman loves to have touched, don't let shame get in the way. Don't back off. You'll see her eyes shine with a trembling light, as when the sun glitters on rippling water. She'll moan and murmur sweet words just right for the game. But don't outpace your mistress, or let her leave you in the dust. Rush to the finish line in unison. When man and woman collapse together, they both win. That's the greatest prize.
Ovid's sizzling words gripped Rome when they were first published, but a decade later they would return to haunt him. For the patience of the Emperor Augustus had reached its lowest point. Beleaguered, he saw plots in every corner, anarchy in every act of disobedience. Blaming the subversive book, Augustus banished Ovid from Rome.
Hello, are you there? If so, indulge these verses of mine. They don't come from my garden or that old couch I used to sprawl on. Whoever you are, and in whatever parlor, bedroom, or study, I have been writing on decks, propped up against bulkheads.
The poet was sent to an untamed backwater at the edges of the empire on the shores of the Black Sea. For Ovid, the ultimate urban sophisticate, no punishment could have been harsher. His roguish aplomb crumbled to anguish.
When night falls here, I think of that other night, when I was cast out into the endless gloom. We managed to laugh once or twice, as my wife found in some old trunk odd pieces of clothing. This might be the thing this season, the new Romanian mode. And just as abruptly, our peal of laughter would catch and tear into tears. And we held each other. My wife sobbed at the hearth. What could I say? I took the first step with which all journeys begin, but could not take the second. I was barely able to breathe. I set forth again. Behind me, she fell rolling onto the floor. Her hair swept into the hearth, stirring up the dust and ashes. I heard her call my name. I thought I had survived the worst. What could be worse? But my wife arose, pursued me, held on to me, weeping. Servants pulled her away. Whatever worth there was in me died there.
Ovid was sure his talents would bring him home. He wrote constantly, and as he waited, he sought refuge in a remote frontier town. When the temperatures dropped, Ovid wrote, wine froze in its vessels, the river in its banks. Across the ice thundered hostile horsemen, plundering and killing. It was a brutal life, Ovid wrote home from exile, a side of the empire that few Romans ever saw.
Beyond these rickety walls, there's no safety. And inside, it's hardly better. Barbarians live in most of the houses. Even if you're not afraid of them, you'll despise their long hair and clothes made of animal skins. They all do business in their common language. I have to communicate with gestures. I am understood by no one, and the stupid peasants insult my Latin words. They heckle me to my face and mock my exile.
Writing for this audience, Ovid complained, was like dancing in the dark. As the years passed, Ovid shriveled into a bony old man. He fell ill. Contrition replaced his former bravado.
Oh, I repent, I repent. If anyone as wretched as I can be believed, I do repent. I am tortured by my deed.
Ovid, however, never got an answer to his pleas, and would never get a reprieve. As he approached death, he became sadly resigned to his fate.
Look at me. I yearn for my country, my home, and for you. I've lost everything that I once had. But I still have my talent. Emperors have no jurisdiction over that. My fame will survive, even after I am gone. And as long as Rome dominates the world, I will be read.
9 years into his exile, Ovid died. He outlived Augustus, but he had bent to the emperor's will. At the start of the emperor's public life, Augustus had won the wars engulfing Rome. By the end, he had won the peace, and men like Ovid paid the price. In the years ahead, when lesser men would rule Rome, that price would rise higher still.
Jupiter and Mars and all gods that raised the Roman Empire to ruler of the world, I invoke you and I pray, guard this prosperity, this peace, now and into the future.
In the year 14, prayers such as these were heard around the vast dominion ruled by Rome. For in that year the empire stood at a precipice. The Emperor Augustus had died. Augustus had been a towering figure. He had extinguished a century of civil war. He presided over 40 years of internal peace and prosperity. He forged the vision and power that cemented the empire together. But the peace of Augustus came at a price. By the end of his life, Augustus had eclipsed the Senate, ruled as a monarch, and founded a dynasty that was fraught with troubles. His heirs, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, these men would lead Rome through years of political terror, imperial madness, assassination, and through the distant founding of a new religion that would one day engulf the empire itself. The years to come would be years of trial, testing the endurance of subjects and citizens, soldiers and slaves, the men and women of the Roman Empire in the 1st century.
How miraculous. We can now sail to Spain in just 4 days, Gaul in 3 days, and we can reach Africa on the gentlest breeze overnight.
As the 1st century unfolded, ancient observers were awestruck by their shrinking world.
Incredibly, even Egypt is barely 7 days' journey.
For the empire that Augustus left behind was now more than a collection of conquered lands. It was a far-flung society of vibrant commerce and frequent travel. By the year 14, the people of modern-day France, Turkey, Syria, Greece, Spain, and North Africa were all part of Rome. They contributed to its wealth and gained from its protection. But at Augustus's death, the family of Rome also included some troubling members. Egypt, conquered some 45 years earlier, remained an exotic land of disturbing power. Judea, added to a half-century before, was a tinderbox. And in Germany, local tribes resisted full subjugation. Then there was Britain. Once Julius Caesar had proudly claimed the island for Rome. But his claim did not hold, and at Augustus's death, Britain still lay tantalizingly beyond grasp. As he lay dying, Augustus assumed a philosophical air. "Did I play my part well in this comedy of life?" he asked. The answer was a resounding yes. The Senate declared Augustus a god, and as he passed into legend, he passed the torch of leadership to a man who had stood in the shadows for 50 years, his grown stepson, Tiberius. The years of waiting had come with wrenching sacrifice. Once Tiberius had been happily married, but he had been forced to divorce his wife and marry the emperor's daughter. Tiberius complied with Augustus's order, but his biographer reports that he was never the same.
Tiberius had loved his wife. After the divorce, he grieved that he had pushed her away and had great anguish in his soul. The one time he caught sight of her, he watched her with such strained and swollen eyes that an officer was assigned to keep her from his presence.
Despite his sacrifice, Tiberius had been spurned. Augustus only chose him after more favored heirs had died. And still, Tiberius's position was insecure, for the Senate was leery. Its members needed leadership, but hated monarchy, and many resented the turn to hereditary rule.
Tiberius was in an impossible situation. He did not expect to become emperor originally. He was not Augustus's first choice. He was not Augustus. He had not accomplished what Augustus had. So the negotiation of his role with regard to those who were his social peers was very difficult indeed.
The Senate chamber was tense as Augustus's will was read. Tiberius moved warily to claim his legacy, and he gave confusing signals. Would Tiberius assume full imperial powers, the senators asked. No, he responded. Which branch of government will you direct? One member called out. Tiberius was silent. How long will Rome remain headless? Shouted another.
Tiberius wanted power, all right. The excuse for behaving in the way he does is that that's how Augustus himself had done it. He's trying to be a good Augustus lookalike. Augustus came to power by refusing it. He feels he too must refuse. But somehow, subtly, oddly, he got the game wrong. He refused too much. He didn't convince anyone that his refusal was genuine, and he only caused resentment.
As Tiberius groped awkwardly to define his role, events outside Rome turned ominous. A message arrived from the provinces. 2 armies on the northern frontier were refusing orders. It started among the legions in modern-day Hungary and Austria, just 10 days' march from Rome. One disgruntled soldier voiced the bitter realities of army life, and mounting a rostrum made of dirt, he stoked the fires of resentment.
Old men are enduring 30 and 40 years of service. Many have even lost limbs. And discharge does not end it. They do the same work by a different name. And if by some chance one survives, he is dragged to the ends of the earth and given payment with a swampy marsh or sterile mountainside. By Hercules, life in the legions is brutal and unprofitable.
Gradually, the arguments struck home. Soldiers began showing their scars. Some looted. Officers were killed. And with words of defiance ringing in the air, mutiny gained momentum.
Why should you obey like slaves? When will you dare demand payback, if not with a new and wavering emperor?
It was Rome's worst nightmare, and it demanded attention from the imperial family. With the new emperor busy in Rome, another family member was sent to quell the rebellion. He was called Germanicus. He was young, charismatic, and loved by the soldiers as a man of the legions. His wife had even given birth in an army outpost, and the couple's 2-year-old son wore a tiny army uniform. Bootsy, the soldiers called him. In Latin, Caligula. The child was the darling of the Roman legions, their imperial mascot. When Germanicus and his family reached the mutinous camp, it was clear that more violence loomed. Their very lives were at risk. Germanicus consulted his advisors. He tearfully urged his wife to seek refuge with a nearby tribe. She agreed, leaving with little Caligula in her arms. Some years later, the historian Tacitus recorded the scene.
A wretched group of women marched away. The commander's wife, a refugee, clutching her small son to her breast, surrounded by the weeping wives of his comrades. The wailing was noticed by the soldiers, who came out of their tents. They felt shame and pity, and thought of her forefathers, and of her son, a child born and raised among the tents. They begged, they insisted that she come back.
Rebel unity was broken. Germanicus became a hero, and Caligula and his mother returned to camp.
Caligula, as a child in the middle of this mutiny, must have seen the importance of the loyalty of the army. And in fact, he had been the darling of the soldiers, and he could appreciate the loyalty that the army felt to the imperial family in Rome. And yet he also could see what would happen if the soldiers' expectations weren't met. They were not going to maintain the loyalty.
Army loyalty, Caligula saw, was the core of imperial strength. But events would offer Caligula another darker lesson. Popularity could be a dangerous thing. Just 5 years later, Caligula's father Germanicus lay dying, poisoned, it was believed, on orders from the emperor. Tiberius insisted he played no part in the death of Germanicus, but neither did he mourn, for he well knew that public favorites could be as threatening as army mutinies, and survival demanded brutal vigilance. Governing Rome, Tiberius mused, was like holding a wolf by the ears. That reality would stalk the imperial family for generations to come.
I must go and have a bath. Yes, it's time. I get myself some towels, I run and catch up with the others, and I say to one and all, how are you? Have a good bath. Have a good supper.
Young and old, rich and poor, men and women, every day in mid-afternoon, countless people around the empire ended their work and made their way to the baths.
Labor and worry be gone. I sing the baths, bejeweled with shining tiles.
Most bath complexes were large, congenial places where all classes mingled in one of the great unifying rituals of Roman life. They included outdoor areas for exercise, food stands for snacks, and noisy attendants who offered every sort of service.
I would die if silence were as necessary to study as they say. I live just above the bathhouse.
The philosopher Seneca found his local bath a mixed blessing.
Consider all the hateful voices I hear. When the brawny men exercise with their lead weights, I hear their groans and gasps. Or when someone else comes in to get a vulgar massage, I hear the slap of a hand on the shoulders. Add those who leap into the pool with a huge splash. And besides these, who at least have normal voices, consider the hair plucker, always screeching for customers and never quiet, except when he's making someone else cry.
After several hours in the boisterous atmosphere, wealthy Romans headed home for an evening with friends. The less privileged met at roadside cafes. But one and all, Romans cherished their late afternoon rituals as staples of life.
Baths, wine, and sex ruin our bodies. But what makes life worth living except sex, wine, and baths?
Away from the public eye, Augustus's first successor lived in gloom. The Emperor Tiberius was already 55 when he inherited Rome from his stepfather, and he was a dour, cynical man. Embittered by his years of obscurity, Tiberius now resented the courtiers who once scorned him. He despised their intrigues and obsequious manners. Men fit to be slaves, he muttered as he left the Senate house. Many senators thought little better of Tiberius. They grew to hate him for his cryptic wishes and his unpredictable moods.
What really gets up their noses is that he both demands civility from them and then pretends to be treating them like equals and saying, oh, no, don't be servile, don't flatter me. I don't want this adulation that you offer me. And yet it was clear to them that unless he was flattered. Unless they behaved like slaves, he wasn't actually happy. That's why they called him a hypocrite.
With mutual contempt between senators and Tiberius, the emperor sought counsel outside their ranks in a cavalry officer named Sejanus, a man the ancient historian Tacitus called a small-town cheater.
Sejanus was brazen, with great physical endurance. Outwardly, he appeared honorable, but inside, he nursed a greedy nature.
You have to remember that the Romans could be extraordinarily snobbish. The Romans weren't against social mobility, absolutely, but they hated to see upstarts who they see as getting into power not because they're good, but because they cheat the system, because they worm their way into the favor of the emperors, and they cheat themselves into social standing.
Tiberius gave Sejanus command of the Praetorian Guard, an elite battalion created to keep order and protect the emperor. Sejanus concentrated his troops in a single camp. Billeted in one place, Tacitus says, the Guard enhanced Sejanus's political influence.
When the camp was finished, he insinuated himself into the soldiers' affections, speaking to each man to man. He chose their leaders himself, and to senators he hinted at offices and provincial posts for those who supported him.
Tiberius offered his aide the highest honors. He openly praised Sejanus, calling him the partner of my labors, and Sejanus reveled in the emperor's trust. He would use it to clear a path for his own power and subject Rome to a reign of terror reminiscent of its darkest past. Germanicus, the hero of the army mutiny, was dead. Now, Sejanus warned, the dead man's family was plotting to seize power. Germanicus's widow was parted from her children and sent into exile. In Rome, young Caligula was spared abuse, but his older brothers were less fortunate. Suetonius describes their fate.
Both were judged to be traitors and sentenced to death. One in the basement of the imperial palace, where starvation drove him to eat the stuffing from his pillow. It is believed that the other committed suicide when an executioner came and showed him a noose and the hooks for dragging his corpse through the city. Their ravaged remains were so scattered that it was very difficult to collect them.
This is what's wrong with the system that Augustus established. It's a system that's only as strong as the male member of the family who comes to power is, emotionally and physically. And while there were some very impressive people, most notably Augustus, who assumed this role, there were others who had a great deal wrong with them. And a lot of what was wrong with them was merely living in this household where people are constantly vying for power and favor.
The emperor's aide Sejanus soon widened his purge. He launched treason trials. Rivals were routinely convicted, and according to Tacitus, executed.
It was a time of corruption, greed, and subservience. Not only the elite felt insecure in their positions, but even lower-ranked officials competed to perform foul and slavish acts.
Barely a decade after Augustus had died, the dynasty he founded was failing Rome. The now elderly Tiberius would not, or could not, stop the purge.
Where was Tiberius when the trials and other atrocities and persecutions were going on towards the end of his reign? It's difficult to tell. He had withdrawn from the city because he was tired of the capital and its politics. He may have known of some of the trials that were going on. He may not. He may have simply been duped. How do we know? It's very difficult to tell.
In the year 26, disgusted and insecure, Tiberius had turned his back on Rome and retreated to the island of Capri, an isolated refuge that offered security from his enemies and diversions for his troubled mind.
Once retired to Capri, he set up rooms for his depraved urges.
Perched in one of the 12 cliff-top villas, Tiberius sought release in astrology, in wine, and according to his gossipy biographer Suetonius, in all manner of self-indulgence.
He procured groups of girls and boys known for their sexual inventions. They enacted their unique depravities before him to arouse his failing sex drive. He decorated the bedrooms with erotic paintings, figurines, and Egyptian pornography. So they knew the work they were expected to put out.
Only Sejanus had regular access to the reclusive emperor. And after Tiberius's own son died, only Sejanus enjoyed the emperor's trust. In Rome, he assumed all the powers of his absent patron and ruled with growing autonomy. Sejanus, it seemed, was poised to displace Tiberius himself.
Sejanus had clearly been plotting to secure the emperorship for himself. There's no doubt about that, and he had waged campaigns against members of the imperial family. It's very difficult to know what caused his undoing in the end, because we don't have a complete account.
In the year 31, events took a surprising turn. Tiberius suddenly soured on Sejanus and suddenly embraced Caligula, the only surviving son of his imperial family. Tiberius called Caligula to Capri. Then he sent a secret message to the Senate condemning Sejanus. The ancient historian Cassius Dio tells the story as it was recounted to him.
At sunrise, the emperor's agent climbed the hill where the Senate was convening in the Temple of Apollo. He found Sejanus outside. He consoled him with lies, telling him that he was about to be named next in line. Ecstatic, Sejanus ran into the building.
As the emperor's agent slipped away, Tiberius's letter was read aloud. Line by line, it condemned Sejanus. Slowly, senators inched away.
The presiding officer called Sejanus forward, but he did not obey because he had never taken orders. He was called a second and third time. Then the officer said, "Sejanus, come here." Sejanus answered blankly, "Are you calling me?" He whom they once worshipped, they now led to execution.
Sejanus was strangled. His body was dumped into the river Tiber. In an age of emperors, violence was the only recourse for the aggrieved, and brutality always lurked near the surface.
What we might understand from Sejanus' downfall is that no one was secure within the court system. This was a secretive form of government. Power was pursued by those who were unscrupulous and wanted to wield it, but no one could be secure in his control of power. The emperor could strike down anyone at a moment's notice.
Still in Capri, Tiberius continued the business of government. His rivals had all been destroyed, but so had the chance of stable succession. As Tiberius entered his last years, weary and remote, his only surviving heir was Caligula.
To the official in charge of revenues, it is now nearly 2 years ago that Apollonius made off with my dowry, and he left me with the female child, which we conceived together, in rags.
Although emperors often struck down their political enemies, Millions of anonymous people around the empire led less eventful lives. They paid taxes, struggled to support their families, and when problems arose, they appealed to Roman administrators for relief.
My husband has journeyed by boat down to Alexandria, and he has joined himself there to another woman. He has told his father to sell our house. Since I lack even basic nourishment, I ask you to order him to be summoned before you, and to help compel him to return the dowry to me for life's necessities.
Many lived on the brink of ruin. In their towns and cities, in Egypt, Italy, and around the Mediterranean, they endured filthy streets, rampant disease, recurrent famine. Emperors tried to alleviate suffering by offering free grain to some 250,000 Romans, but even this wasn't enough. For many of the nameless poor, feeding their families was an impossible task, especially in the Roman province of Judea, modern-day Israel. There, on the empire's desert fringe, the dry soil supported meager harvests, and Roman taxes added to the burden. The Jews of Judea were fervently religious. Among them was a family from a village near the Sea of Galilee.
In those days, an order was sent by the Emperor Augustus to register the entire world. All went to their own towns.
Long before Tiberius's accession, Augustus had ordered a census. It was an enormous undertaking. From Gaul to Egypt, from Asia to Judea, millions registered with Roman officials.
And Joseph also went from the city of Nazareth in Galilee to be registered with Mary, whom he was to wed and who was expecting a child.
Joseph was a Jewish carpenter. If the birth of his son caught Rome's attention at all, it was only as a statistic. But Jesus, growing to maturity in his father's trade, would leave a legacy more enduring than Augustus himself. A legacy made possible by the extraordinary ferment of the first century. For in this corner of the empire, at this moment in history, Judea was in turmoil. The population had split into hostile factions. Preachers and prophets roamed the countryside, drawing emotional crowds. At the age of 30, Jesus joined one such group and was baptized in the Jordan River. Soon Jesus began a ministry of his own, and like other itinerant preachers of his day, he walked between villages, taking his message to the homes and synagogues of Judea's poor.
No one can serve two masters. You cannot serve God and wealth. And so I say to you, do not worry about what you will eat or what you will drink, or about what you will wear. Is life not more than food and the body more than clothes? Behold, the birds in the sky. They neither sow, nor reap, nor gather into barns, and yet your Father in heaven feeds them. Are you not more precious than they? Blessed are the poor in spirit, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth.
The Roman Empire provides the historical context for Jesus' words and deeds. And without taking that context seriously, much of what we know or even think we know about Jesus becomes inscrutable. Jesus speaks of the rule of God. He speaks of relief and hope for the poor, the dispossessed, the disinherited. He's speaking to a lot of people who meet that description. And he's saying that God is going to do something about this situation, that God is doing something about this situation right now.
Jesus' talk about a kingdom greater than Rome electrified his listeners. But his disciples' astounding claim that Jesus was literally God's son also caused offense, and his demanding terms threatened to unravel thousands of years of social tradition.
Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to pit a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother.
Even the people from his own small village were outraged. They drove Jesus out of town. They led him to a cliff and threatened to hurl Jesus over the edge. He escaped, but his ministry continued to draw fire.
But Jesus would say things like to this young man who came to Jesus and said, I want to follow you, but first I have to go and bury my parents. And he said, let the dead bury the dead. You come and follow me. And this was an utterly provocative thing to say in a period where a child's filial responsibility to bury their parents was utterly fundamental.
About the year 33, Jesus traveled to the city of Jerusalem for Passover. He joined throngs of pilgrims from around the world. Pilgrims who arrived with foreign monies, seeking animals to sacrifice at Jerusalem's sacred temple. Jesus was appalled. Commerce, he believed, defiled the holy site.
In the temple, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and money changers seated for business. Making a whip from cords, he drove them all out of the temple. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those selling the doves, he said, "Take these things out of here. Do not make my Father's house a marketplace."
The outburst enraged religious leaders, but worse, it threatened to disrupt the precarious political stability imposed by Rome. Jesus was arrested, probably for political subversion, and to the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, the sentence was obvious: crucifixion.
I think it's crucial to look at the story of Jesus from the Roman point of view. What did the crucifixion of Jesus look like? It looked like they had justly, through just processes, gotten rid of a rabble-rouser, a criminal, and maintained the Roman peace, maintained stability and social order. But what did the Christians do with this? They turned it on its head, and they made this criminal, who the Romans had justly and rightly put to death, their hero and their God whom they worshipped. The Romans got that. The Romans understood political subversion when they heard it.
The decision to execute Jesus would launch a religion that would one day subsume the Roman Empire and resonate for millennia to come. But the man who ordered the crucifixion fell quickly from grace. Pontius Pilate's mismanagement soon brought Judea to the brink of revolt, and the Roman governor was ordered home in disgrace. Fate, however, would spare him imperial censure, for as Pilate sailed for Rome, the Emperor Tiberius died.
At the baths, there is no way to escape Monogenes. If you take some towels, he will call them whiter than snow, although they may be dirtier than a baby's lap. As you comb your thin hair, he will say you look like Achilles. He will praise everything, marvel at everything, until, worn down by his boring efforts, you invite him home.
The antics of status-conscious Romans delighted ancient humorists, for in some circles, wheedling a place at a rich man's table was a daily dance, to fail a social disgrace.
My friend swears that he has never dined at home, and that is so. He just doesn't eat without an invitation.
Dinner was an artful affair. Upper-class Romans reclined on couches and were served by slaves. They enjoyed music, poetry, and endless delicacies. But those of more modest means enjoyed more modest amenities, as revealed by graffiti scribbled as comic dialogue 2,000 years ago.
Innkeeper, let's settle my bill.
You owe 1 coin for wine, 1 for bread, and 2 for relish.
Agreed?
The girl you had costs 8 coins.
Yes.
And the hay for your mule is 2 more.
That wretched mule will finish me off.
In the year 37, the empire shifted into a lighter mood, for Caligula, now 25 years old, had become emperor.
By assuming command, Caligula fulfilled the wishes of the Roman people, or should I say, the whole world.
Caligula had suffered mightily from palace intrigue. As the lone survivor of a charismatic father, as the grown mascot of Rome's army, many hoped Caligula would breathe energy into the gloomy city. At first, Caligula lived up to expectations. He recalled exiles and hosted a bonfire where he ceremoniously burned the records of his predecessor's treason trials. But soon, Caligula began to show disturbing eccentricities. 2 years into his rule, Caligula led an army north. When he reached the sea, the emperor prepared to invade Britain, the land that had eluded Julius Caesar. Then, inexplicably, Caligula ordered the legions to gather seashells.
What is going on when Caligula goes up to the North Sea and starts collecting seashells? Well, Caligula had been seriously ill the preceding year. He may or may not have had something like encephalitis. There's also reason to believe that there's some troubled hereditary strain in this family, and that Caligula suffers from, we might want to call it, bipolar behavior.
Tyranny descended on Rome as Caligula's quirks grew into abominations. Once, during a sacred ritual, Caligula was to offer an animal to the gods. But as he raised his mallet to kill the sacrifice, a whim brought it down on the nearby priest. The man died instantly. Caligula dressed in silken and bejeweled robes. He forced senators to grovel on the ground and kiss his feet. He openly seduced their wives at dinner parties, and he discussed the women's sexual performance over dessert.
There's no doubt that Caligula was strange, grotesque, and perhaps even really clinically insane. His reign does show the dangers of hereditary succession within the system that Augustus had founded. Military monarchy of the Augustan kind did work. There's no doubt about that. But its danger was that if an hereditary system was used, you could never guarantee that the ruler of the day was going to be an effective ruler. And certainly with Caligula, we find one emperor who was an absolute disaster.
The disastrous Caligula brought Rome's elite to its knees, and other Roman subjects to the brink of despair.
In Rome, on the far side of the Tiber, there was a large Jewish neighborhood.
The Jewish scholar, Philo, belonged to one of the empire's many religious minorities. Most of the groups, most of the time, had long enjoyed remarkable freedom. The Jews were just one example.
Most were Romans. They were brought into Italy as prisoners of war and had been freed by their masters. But they were not forced to betray the customs of their forefathers. And when Augustus distributed money and grain, the Jews received as much as everyone else.
But Caligula was not Augustus, and in the year 39, in Philo's city of Alexandria, Egypt, all tolerance broke down. Non-Jews put statues of human gods in the city's synagogues. When affronted Jews tore them out, violence erupted.
The mongrel crowd attacked us and ran through our houses, turning out the inhabitants. Huge mobs of men destroyed the meeting houses, setting many fires in their manic, senseless rage. They drove men, women, and children like cattle into small pens, leaving them to starve and suffocate, and others, while still living, they bound with straps around their ankles and dragged them through the market, leaping on them and defiling their corpses.
It was a gruesome tragedy, and it came at an unfortunate time. For emperors alone could mediate such disasters, and the Emperor Caligula was past caring. Philo and some fellow Jews set out to seek an audience. They traveled all the way from northern Egypt to Rome. But when they entered Caligula's presence, they knew their mission was doomed.
When we were brought before him, we bowed to the ground out of humility and offered our hands, calling him the most holy emperor. Growling and snarling, he responded, "Are you those God-haters?"
The emperor was inspecting a villa under renovation. As he flitted from garden to building, the Jewish envoys strained to keep pace.
We followed close behind, up and down, mocked by our enemies. When he had given some orders about the building, he asked us this solemn question: "Why don't you eat pork?" Our adversaries burst into laughter. We began to speak, but with our arguments so abused and ground to dust, we stopped trying and looked forward to nothing but death.
Philo and his companions were not killed, but neither were they successful. As the men consoled each other back in their lodgings, they were staggered by yet another blow. Word came that Caligula had ordered a statue carved showing himself as a god, and planned to erect it in the Temple of Jerusalem, the holiest place for Jews worldwide. It was the ultimate sacrilege, and sure to cause new eruptions of violence.
Those living in and around the holy city, as if answering a single sign, left their homes and rushed as one to the camp of the Roman governor.
Philo says that the elders swore to die on the spot rather than see their temple defiled. But their sacrifice proved unnecessary, for the Jews were not the only ones Caligula had pushed beyond endurance. Back in Rome, soon after their petition arrived, the emperor paid for his misdeeds. Caligula was murdered, killed by his closest aides.
I, an honorably discharged veteran, have made a will. I order that my 2 slave women, over 30 years of age, become free.
Here rests a free handmaiden. This monument testifies to the harmony she shared with her mistress and spouse. Good wishes and goodbye.
Slavery was an abusive and degrading institution, and it had a long history in the ancient world. But in Rome, slavery had a remarkable feature: manumission. Roman owners freed their slaves in considerable numbers. Former slaves could work as craftsmen, midwives, merchants. Sometimes they achieved wealth. But in Rome's status-conscious world, even successful freedmen found the stigma of slavery hard to erase.
We approached the house. At the entrance stood a doorkeeper shelling peas into a silver bowl. Over the door, a magpie squawked a greeting to guests from his golden cage.
The Roman nobleman Petronius had a sharp eye for satire. In his novel, The Satyricon, Petronius lampooned the lifestyle of former slaves by depicting a vulgar dinner party through the eyes of a fictional guest.
We reached the dining room. Boys from Egypt poured cooled water on our hands while others ministered to our feet, removing the hangnails with precision. I began chatting with my neighbor. Who was that woman running here and there? The host's wife, he replied. She counts her money by the bushel. But take care you don't scorn the other freedmen here. They're oozing wealth, too. You see that one reclining at the end of the couch? Today he's worth 800,000. He's newly freed. Not too long ago, he carried wood on his back.
Petronius Satyricon is a wonderful insight into all sorts of social prejudices in a situation where one of the big phenomena of the 1st century AD is the rise of the freed slave. The desire of the freed slave to become a look-alike real Roman. And the characters in Petronius are these ex-slaves who are all trying it on as Romans. They're dining like Romans, they're bathing like Romans. They're trying to quote bits of ancient literature, mythology, as if they were proper Romans. They get it wrong all the time, socially, subtly wrong, in a way that a Roman aristocrat, such as Petronius, can laugh at them.
In the imperial family, another figure was the object of ridicule. His name was Claudius. In his infancy, Claudius's body was racked by a mysterious illness. To his family's shame, his biographer Suetonius tells us, Claudius was disfigured for the rest of his life.
When he walked, his knees buckled. He had an indecent laugh. And, even more disgusting, when he was angry, spittle flew from his mouth. His nose ran, his tongue stumbled, and his head wobbled with the slightest exertion.
Claudius was the butt of jokes. When he dozed after dinner, guests pelted him with food. They put slippers on his hands and roared with laughter when Claudius awoke, rubbing his face with his shoes. But in the year 41, the laughter suddenly stopped. After the Emperor Caligula was murdered, Claudius became the sole surviving heir of Augustus.
Shut out by those conspiring against Caligula, Claudius retired to private rooms. Not much later, after news of the murder, he crept out, terrified, to a nearby sunroom and hid himself in the curtains. A soldier happened to notice his feet. Claudius fell to his knees in fear. But the soldier recognized him and hailed Claudius emperor.
Claudius is a strangely sympathetic figure to us, and partly that's because he was turned into such a figure of fun by his contemporaries that it's hard not to try to see beyond what they were laughing at and see a quite serious figure trying to do something sensible.
Claudius would surprise everyone. The unlikely emperor rose every morning just after midnight to begin work. He passed laws protecting sick slaves. He increased women's privileges. He apologized to petitioners for the lack of chairs. This sort of behavior, Suetonius reports, endeared him to the people. Surprising gestures were followed by stunning acts. Succeeding where the great Julius Caesar had failed, Claudius finally established Roman rule in Britain. It was the foremost addition to the empire since Augustus's death. But there was more. For centuries, the Roman Senate had resisted new blood. In the year 48, Claudius argued that men from Gaul, modern France, be seated amongst them.
Why did Sparta and Athens fall, though mighty in arms? if not because they kept their subjects segregated. Now that the Gauls have joined with us in marriage and culture, let them add their gold and wealth to ours, rather than keep it to themselves. What we do today will set an example for the future.
The old order was defiant. He was determined, one senator sneered, to see all Greeks, Gauls, Spaniards, and Britons wearing the toga. But Claudius won the day. The empire took another step toward integration. It was a solid victory, but it would be followed by anguish, for Claudius was no less vulnerable to intrigue than those who preceded him. In fact, Tacitus tells us, he was more so.
And this was the end of his ignorance towards matters in his own house.
In the eyes of many, Claudius's weak spot was his wife, Messalina. The emperor adored her, but she did not return his devotion. Instead, Messalina indulged her passions, for luxury, and for affairs with palace servants. Claudius always looked away, but in the year 48, the affairs of Messalina suddenly turned sinister. She took a new lover, this time a nobleman, and her affair was widely thought to signal a coup in the making. Act fast, a loyal freedman urged Claudius, or her new man controls Rome. Claudius rushed back to the capital and ordered his guards to kill Messalina's lover. The empress fled to a friend's villa to compose an appeal. Claudius's anger began to wane, but his freedman took no chances.
He told their guards and their commander to kill Messalina. A freedman was chosen to carry out the deed. Rushing ahead of the officers, he found her cowering on the ground, with her mother sitting nearby. She had often disapproved of her daughter, but was now overcome by pity. "Life is past," she said, "and there is nothing left but to seek an honorable death." But there was no honor in that spirit so corrupted with lust. The doors gave way to the oncoming attack. The commander stood before her in silence as he delivered the fatal blow.
Claudius was hosting a dinner party when news reached him that his wife had died. Without asking whether it was suicide or murder, he called for more wine. Claudius, Rome's most improbable ruler, had salvaged, even enhanced the empire of Augustus. But he too held a wolf by the ears, and in the years ahead, Claudius would begin to lose his grip.
Dearest Mother, what other place could be so desolate, with cliffs so steep as this rock? What else so barren, so uncivilized?
Near the middle of the 1st century, a man named Seneca was banished for offending the Roman emperor. He was a living reminder that absolute power could bring absolute ruin, and he was not alone. One man's exile, Seneca wrote, was but a drop in the sea of human upheaval. For in the first century, no one was immune from imperial abuse. The emperor's whim was law, and the emperor's law could be harsh, especially under Nero. During his erratic rule, fire would gut the city of Rome. Christians would pay the price, and brutality would sweep the empire. Soon, winds of change would begin to blow. First in the provinces, then in the very heart of the Roman Empire in the first century.
In his youth, Claudius set out to write a history. His first public reading was nerve-wracking. At the beginning, a fat man sat down and broke some benches. The audience burst into roars of laughter. Even when the crowd settled, Claudius could not control himself, but kept remembering the incident and dissolving into laughter.
Writing 2,000 years ago, an imperial biographer describes a world ruled by Rome, and Rome ruled by an unlikely man. His name was Claudius. Claudius limped and stuttered, an embarrassment to his imperial family. He lived most of his life in the shadows. He found solace as an amateur scholar, without power or influence. But as the first century neared its midpoint, a twist of fate had left Claudius emperor, and his critics amazed. For Claudius took the helm of the world's greatest empire with more confidence than any man since the dynasty began. Claudius expanded Roman territory. To the south, he completed Rome's conquest of North Africa. To the north, he subdued the fiercely independent tribes of Britain. From Turkey to Morocco, from the Red Sea to the North Sea, the many faces of the ancient world had become part of one empire. But Claudius did more than expand the empire. He passed laws protecting sick slaves. He allowed conquered peoples to become citizens, even members of the Senate.
I like Claudius. I find Claudius very winning, not just because of the adversity of his youth, his illness, his limp, his stutter, but when he does come to power, he's truly humane toward slaves. He cares about the peoples of the empire, and he seems to be quite remarkable for a man who had no chance whatever of attaining the imperial throne.
But the tranquil years would soon veer sharply off course, and the empire would confront the ugly face of imperial rule. Despite his power, Claudius was fragile. His life had been plagued by plots and betrayal. Most of his family had been killed by political enemies, and Claudius himself had endured the execution of a disloyal wife. Now, in the year 49, Claudius was seeking a new wife. Roman society mobilized. The rivalry was intense. Many families sought to link their bloodlines with the emperors. While they schemed, Claudius hesitated, and tensions grew. Finally, Claudius made a decision that startled Rome. Writing some years later, a historian named Tacitus explained why. The emperor chose to wed his own niece, a woman of steely resolve and questionable character. Her name was Agrippina.
From this point, the empire was changed. All obeyed a woman. But this was a woman without feminine frivolity. She was openly severe and often arrogant. Agrippina's dominance was almost masculine.
The most tragic thing about Agrippina is that she wrote memoirs, and they have been lost. And I would give anything to hear her side of the story. The frustrating thing about recovering Roman women is that so little from them survives. It may not have been very different from what Roman men would have said about them. But it would be wonderful to hear her rationale for why she did what she did her way.
Agrippina turned her back on Roman ideals of feminine virtue. She seized power directly and used it proudly. Agrippina struck down her rivals, founded a colony in her own name, and reversing her new husband, Tacitus tells us, she secured the pardon of one of his exiles, the writer and philosopher Seneca.
Agrippina did not want to be known only for wicked deeds, so she obtained a pardon for Seneca. She assumed this would please the public because he was a popular author. She also wanted Seneca to tutor her young son.
Her son was Nero, a 12-year-old boy by a previous marriage, and still just a pawn in Agrippina's drive for total control. Another pawn was Seneca, all too eager to leave exile behind him.
Seneca, she believed, would join her plans for supremacy out of gratitude for her favors.
As Seneca returned to the capital's ruthless politics, he faced a stark dilemma. He had always scorned luxury and power, and condemned moral slackness. But Seneca was obliged to Agrippina, and driven by ambition. After languishing for a decade in obscurity, he was drawn to the promise of influence and to the thrill of Rome.
Look around at the huge influx of people, which even a city as large and diverse as Rome can scarcely house. From the whole world they converge. Ambition draws some. Others are compelled by duty. Many thirst for liberal studies. Others crave spectacles. Some put their beauty on sale. Others sell their eloquence. The entire human race has flocked here. A city offering rich returns for both virtues and vices.
Inside the imperial palace, Seneca would encounter far more vice than virtue. For after luring Claudius into marriage, Agrippina had begun to weave an elaborate plot. First, pushing aside Claudius's son, she convinced the emperor to adopt Nero and designate him heir. With the line of succession now clear, Tacitus says, Agrippina's only remaining obstacle was her husband.
Her plans for murder were firm. As she bided her time, waiting for opportunity, Agrippina sought the right poison. A specialist in the field was chosen, and by her skill, a potion prepared. It was delivered to Claudius by the eunuch who served and tasted his food.
Claudius collapsed, teetered on the brink of death, then began to recover. Horrified, Agrippina quickly enlisted the emperor's own physician in her crime. While pretending to help Claudius vomit his tainted food, the doctor put a feather dipped in poison down the emperor's throat. Dangerous crimes, Tacitus commented, bring ample reward. Claudius, the emperor of Rome, was dead. Within hours, the palace gates were thrown open. Agrippina's son was declared emperor, and Seneca was launched on a path that would batter his deepest convictions. The reign of Nero had begun.
I am a Jewish man, educated strictly according to the law of our fathers.
In the Roman province of Judea, during the lifetime of the Emperor Claudius, an ardent young Jew named Saul headed for dilemmas all his own. He was seeking the arrest of religious heretics, members of a tiny Jewish sect known as the followers of Jesus. Saul was dedicated to wiping them out.
Indeed, that is what I did in Jerusalem. I imprisoned many and cast my vote against them when they were marked for death. In my extreme fury, I pursued others, even into foreign cities.
But as he walked the road from Jerusalem to Damascus, Saul's future suddenly changed, and with it, the future of his troubled province, its Roman rulers, and of world religion itself.
Around midday, a mighty light from the heavens flashed around me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice say, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" I replied, "Who are you, Lord?" And he said to me, "I am Jesus of Nazareth." I said, "What should I do, Lord?" And the Lord said to me, "Get up and go to Damascus, and there you will be told all that has been ordained for you." Since I could not see, those who were with me took my hand and led me to Damascus.
Saul became Paul, and he dedicated the rest of his life to spreading the word of Jesus with the same zeal he had once directed to wiping it out. Paul's fervor drew converts and hatred. One night, his claim that Jesus was Messiah drew a violent mob. Trapped in a top-floor apartment, Paul avoided death by hiding in a basket. Supporters lowered him to safety through a window. It was but one in a lifetime of narrow escapes. For the next 30 years, Paul traveled some 10,000 miles across territory ruled by Rome. He preached in the empire's great cities, Ephesus, Philippi, Corinth, Athens, and others. Cities that enjoyed imperial grandeur, but cities teeming with poor and desperate subjects of Rome. They made eager audiences for Paul's message of eternal life.
There's a legend that says that Paul's family was originally enslaved by Romans and then later liberated from slavery by Romans. And this is how Paul's family received Roman citizenship. That is, Paul has internalized the experience of slavery and freedom. Paul speaks a message that finds power in this powerlessness, that finds community where community has been destroyed. Paul is the premier poster child for the real Roman Empire in this way, that he speaks to the underside of the Roman imperial experience.
Like Jesus before him, Paul spoke to people in their homes and synagogues. But while Jesus had preached only to Jews, Paul believed his message should be taken to non-Jews, to the Gentiles of the Roman Empire. And that meant relaxing timeless Jewish laws about food and circumcision. it was a radical slap at Jewish tradition and key to the spread of this new faith.
The fact that Paul was a staunch advocate of going to the Gentiles and not requiring of them that they circumcise themselves or follow the Jewish dietary laws was certainly, in the long run, of the greatest importance, because it did mean that Christianity could develop into something that was independent of Judaism. In Paul's day, Christianity was still an outgrowth of Judaism.
Paul's abandonment of the laws of his ancestors horrified many Jewish followers of Jesus. But Paul was adamant. As he left the region of Galatia, now part of Turkey, Paul learned that his disciples were backsliding and requiring converts to be circumcised. Paul sent an angry letter.
You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? I wish those who set you adrift would castrate themselves. You were running well. Who kept you from pursuing the truth? Look, I, Paul, say that if you are circumcised, Christ will bring you no reward. For in Jesus Christ neither circumcision nor foreskins prevail, but only faith acting through love.
Paul was a man of very deep convictions, passionate convictions. He is very invested in these people to whom he's writing. They are his life, and he takes that very seriously. So that passion and the pathos of those troubled relationships that he's negotiating long distance come through in his letters.
Tradition holds that Paul returned to Jerusalem, intent on forcing his views, that he was imprisoned for causing a riot by bringing non-circumcised men into the temple. In jail, Paul reportedly revealed his Roman citizenship and was sent to Rome. Along the way, he was shipwrecked.
3 times I was shipwrecked. 5 times I received the 40 lashes minus 1. Once they stoned me. I've been in danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from false brothers, hungry and thirsty, often without food. And in addition to these threats, every day I am weighed down by my worry for all the churches.
It's been said that Christianity might have been possible without Jesus, but it was certainly not possible without Paul. And that is a very accurate statement, because Paul was able to spread that message to various parts of the Mediterranean, from Palestine to Rome.
No one knows how or where Paul died. On this, the Bible is silent. But wherever he spent his final years, Paul's success outstripped his boldest dreams. He had been stubborn and proud, but Paul had transformed a Jewish splinter group into the beginnings of a world church, a church that would one day conquer Rome itself.
There is a proverb: you have as many enemies as you have slaves, but in truth, we make them our enemies. We abuse them as if they were beasts of burden. When we recline for dinner, one wipes our spittle, another picks up the scraps and crumbs thrown down by drunkards. The point of my argument is this: treat your inferior as you would like to be treated.
The new emperor's tutor, Seneca, had devoted much of his life to ethical problems. He was a follower of Stoic philosophy. In an age of slavery, Stoics advanced the notion of universal humanity, a brotherhood of man that predated Christian doctrine. In an age of opulence, Stoics shunned ostentatious living. And in an age of absolute rule, Stoics walked a narrow path between integrity and hypocrisy.
Seneca was the leading Stoic philosopher of his day. The main teaching of Stoicism was the acceptance of one's fate to play the role that one had been assigned by fate in the world. And so Seneca's fate was to participate in court politics.
Seneca participated in court politics through Nero, now a 16-year-old boy, whose path to the imperial palace had been bathed in blood. Seneca's task was to mold this spirited son of a power-hungry family into a tolerable world leader. And at first, his chances were good, for the young Nero had a sensitive nature. He loved theater, music, and the biographer Suetonius reports the popular pastime of horse racing.
Nero had been passionate about horses from early childhood. At the beginning of his reign, he played every day with toy chariots made of ivory. Soon, he wished to drive a chariot himself. So first, practicing with his slaves, he appeared before the whole city in the circus.
The Roman circus, or racetrack, was a rough and raucous place. Chariot drivers were usually slaves, or former slaves, and fans often cursed rival teams with ferocious partisanship.
I entreat you, O demon, whoever you are, and demand of you from this hour, from this very moment, you crucify the horses of the green and white teams, and that you kill the drivers Clarus and Felix and crush them. Do not leave any breath in them.
Nero's enthusiasm for the sport of commoners scandalized Rome's elite, but it endeared him to the masses. For such is a crowd, sneered the stately historian Tacitus, eager for excitement and thrilled if the emperor shares their taste. Nero did, long past his childhood years.
It is not clear to me that Nero ever changed or that Nero ever grew up. And that was both his strength and his weakness. Nero was an extraordinarily popular emperor. He was like Elvis.
But in ancient Rome, popularity was a mixed blessing. And as the pliable young emperor indulged his various passions, efforts to control him reached a fevered pitch, particularly between the emperor's mother and Seneca. Seneca exerted power discreetly, but Agrippina would not tread lightly. She heard stories that her son seduced married women and young boys, that he castrated and married a male slave, and according to the gossipy Suetonius, much worse.
As soon as it was dark, he was in the habit of going to the taverns wearing a wig. He would wander the streets looking for action, and not just juvenile pranks either. He attacked people on the way home from dinner, stabbed them when they fought back, and threw their bodies into the sewers.
As stories of Nero's degeneracy increased, so too did Agrippina's disapproval. Relations between mother and son deteriorated fast.
As Nero grew older, he quickly, I think, began to realize that he could not rule in his own right as long as Agrippina still had the ambition to rule through him. So it was the clash between two titans, you might say, people both of enormous egos and people with great power lusts. The system didn't allow both of them to rule, so she had to disappear. And if she wouldn't go voluntarily, well, that left Nero little choice.
He decided to kill her. The plot began at a seaside resort. Nero invited his mother to sail down to reconcile their differences. When the reunion ended, Agrippina set out for home. Tacitus tells the story.
The ship had just set sail. Agrippina was attended by 2 servants. One of them stood near the rudder, the other leant over her feet, happily recalling the apologies of Nero and Agrippina's restored favor. Then, a signal was given. The roof collapsed under weights of lead. Agrippina's attendant was crushed and died instantly. But chance intervened. Agrippina was saved by her sturdy couch.
Amid the confusion, Agrippina swam to safety. Nero was stunned to learn that his mother had survived. Back in the imperial palace, he called for Seneca and the commander of his palace guard, a man named Burrus.
It is unclear if they'd been advising Nero from the beginning, but the emperor summoned these men immediately. Shuddering, Nero shouted that Agrippina could appear at any moment. She could incite the soldiers. She could arm her slaves. Seneca and Burrus were silent for a long time. Then Seneca ventured to ask whether Burrus's troops should complete the murder.
Burrus refused to involve his elite battalion, so Nero sent some regular soldiers to finish the job.
An armed and threatening force circled her villa and broke down the doors. They found her in a dimly lit room with a single maid. The assassins surrounded her bed. First, the captain struck her head with a club. Then another soldier drew his sword for the death blow. Agrippina cried out, "Stab my wound!" Again and again they thrust their swords, and she was stabbed to death.
Rome was appalled. Matricide was among the worst impieties a Roman could commit. Nero solemnly informed the Senate that the imperial mother had conspired to overthrow him, her own son. But the excuse was obviously a fiction, and it was not Nero's idea. Seneca had concocted the story to justify his pupil's acts. The moral philosopher was increasingly implicated in the brutal realities of imperial politics.
I write this to you from my winter quarters. I salute you.
Britain was the northern limit of the Roman Empire. Soldiers and their families found it a remote, hostile land with few amenities.
I ask that you send me what I need for the use of my lads. Things I need as soon as possible, since I've just been transferred here. 6 woolen cloaks and 5 tunics.
Lonely letters, preserved in mud for 2,000 years, echo with yearning for loved ones and for the comforts of home.
I have sent you some socks, 2 pairs of sandals, and 2 pairs of underwear.
In the year 60, Britain had been a province for less than 20 years. Like other provinces far from Italy, supply lines were thinly stretched. Without hope of quick reinforcements, 3 legions and a few forts held the entire province. Some settlements, such as the infant community of Londinium, were cities in the making. Rome held tenuous control by maintaining client kings from local tribes and by encouraging tribes to war among themselves. As long as Rome's governor kept them divided, the imperial army was the strongest force on the island. That equation, common throughout the empire, broke down just 4 years after Nero became emperor. It started among the Iceni, a local tribe allied with Rome. When their king died, he left half his estate to his 2 daughters. He offered the other half in tribute to the Emperor Nero. The historian Tacitus tells the story.
The king hoped by such subservience to safeguard his kingdom and home from harm. What happened was just the opposite. First, his wife Boudica was whipped, and his daughters were raped. Then the army laid waste to his land, and his household was raided. The king's own relatives were enslaved.
In response to these outrages, Boudica, the widowed queen, rallied neighboring tribes. Together, they attacked Londinium. The British tribes routed Roman forces. It was an astonishing upset, and it was not the last. As the Romans fell back in retreat, the tribes of Britain seemed poised to reclaim their native land. And Boudica, defying all odds, was poised to enter history among the most fearsome and charismatic leaders ever to defy Rome. As her emboldened forces prepared for another attack, Tacitus has Boudica mounting a rostrum of piled earth and issuing a rallying cry worthy of dread and admiration.
I do not fight to reclaim my birthright, but like you, I fight to avenge my stolen freedom, my abused body, and my raped daughters. The gods bring vengeance to the just. The one legion that dared raise arms against us has fallen. The others yearn to escape. If you consider our numbers and our reasons for war, you will conquer the Romans or die trying.
It could be said that Boudica was the object of respect to some Romans who must have admired the courage that a woman displayed in mounting rebellion against Roman troops. And of course, at first she was very spectacularly successful. She led an uprising which made the Romans really seriously think about the limits of their power in Britain. And they had to respond to her very quickly indeed.
The startled Romans did respond quickly. Soon reinforcements arrived, and the battle-tested Roman army turned the tide. Some 80,000 Britons were massacred. Boudica poisoned herself. Suicide was better than slavery, the predictable fate for defeated enemies of Rome. Tacitus called the outcome a glorious victory, comparable with bygone triumphs. But he meant to be ironic. The Roman peace, Tacitus knew, was imposed by brutal war, and prosperity in the capital was often bought with the blood of conquered peoples. Rome creates a desert, Tacitus later wrote, and calls it peace.
This year saw many omens. Unlucky birds settled on the capital. Houses fell in numerous earthquakes, and the weak were trampled by the fleeing crowd.
Britain had been stabilized, but in Rome the situation was worsening rapidly, for the empire and for Seneca. New advisors had gained the emperor's ear. They criticized Seneca for his excessive wealth and unseemly popularity. They urged the emperor to discard his childhood teacher. Perhaps recognizing his weakened position, perhaps losing his appetite for affairs of state, Seneca asked Nero for permission to retire. The emperor refused. For the next 2 years, Seneca's life was precarious. Then, in AD 64, a new disaster struck.
Fire began in shops near the circus. Fanned by the winds and fed by merchandise, the flames engulfed the entire district. They surged up the hills, consuming all in their path, gaining strength in the city's narrow, twisting roads. The cries of women, children, invalids, frantic people trying to help themselves or others, all added to the panic.
The Great Fire of Rome lasted for 6 days and 7 nights. Of Rome's 14 districts, only 4 remained untouched. Countless temples, homes, and shops were destroyed. When the fire burnt itself out, Nero surveyed the smoldering ruins. He opened public buildings, even his own property, to the homeless. But according to Tacitus, the emperor's aid was cold comfort.
However well-intended, his relief measures were in vain, because a rumor had spread that while fire ravaged the city, Nero was on his private stage, singing.
Nero hadn't fiddled while Rome burned, but his gaiety was equally damning. And worse, it was even said that Nero started the fire himself to clear land for a new palace. The emperor's popularity plummeted. Hostile lampoons appeared on city walls. Insolent citizens even dared to insult Nero in person. Rumors of his role in the fire were so widely believed that the emperor decided to divert attention away from himself. He found a scapegoat in Rome's strange new religious sect, the Christians.
To suppress the rumor, Nero shifted the blame for the fire onto that band called the Christians, hated for their shameful practices.
Jesus had been crucified barely 30 years before, and while his followers were spreading his word, the number of Christians in Rome was still very small. But already, as Tacitus reveals, Christian converts were viewed with suspicion.
The founder of that sect, Christ, had been executed. His death had briefly suppressed the destructive cult, but again erupted, not only in Judea, the birthplace of the evil, but also in Rome, where shameful atrocities fester and spread.
The Christians would have made a good target. After all, their main hero was a criminal who had been put to death by Roman order. In addition to this, they were doing things like exchanging a kiss among brothers and sisters at their meetings, which sounded a little bit like incest. They were also eating the body and drinking the blood of their god, which sounded a bit like cannibalism.
Nero rounded up all the Christians in the city. They were hideously tortured and executed. Then Nero plundered the empire for funds. Temples were robbed of their statues. Treasures that generations had dedicated to the greatness of Rome were absorbed into imperial coffers. For Seneca, this was the last straw. He pretended illness and confined himself to bed. Eventually, Nero allowed his aging tutor to retire to the country. There, on his private estate, Seneca could reflect on the tattered remnants of his honor.
If someone who barks against philosophy should ask the standard question, "Why do you preach more boldly than you live?" I will someday reproach myself more strongly still. But for now, I make this defense. I am not wise and never will be. Demand not that I be equal to the best, but better than the wicked.
Seneca, of course, knows very well that he isn't a perfect man. To play around with the court is to be trapped in a system of hypocrisy. And quite frankly, he pushes Stoicism at the end of his life, when he's trying to distance himself from the vast embarrassments he's got involved in, as he's gradually realized that he can't control the young Nero.
Nero was beyond anyone's control. With his mother dead, his tutor retired, Rome was subject to the whims of an unstable tyrant. Only one course of action could remove him.
A conspiracy was born and grew, a plot which senators, knights, and even women competed to join out of hatred for Nero.
In the year 65, a few defiant Romans began talking of murder. But stymied by fear, they hesitated. Finally, a freed slave named Epicharis took charge. She found a disgruntled officer who had access to the emperor. Meeting him in secret, she begged the officer to strike the first blow, to free Rome of the tyrant.
Epicharis began by listing the emperor's crimes. There was only one way, she said, to punish Nero, and the officer could expect a worthy reward.
It was a fatal mistake. The officer betrayed Epicharis to Nero, and Nero sought revenge. He demanded the names of the plotters. Epicharis refused. He raged. He threatened, and worse.
Assuming a woman's body was not equal to the pain of torture, he ordered her torn to pieces. But neither whips nor fire could break her iron will. Even when dragged back a second day on dislocated limbs, she did not betray her co-conspirators. Thus, this freed slave woman outshone freeborn men, knights, and senators.
The next day, Epicharis tied a noose around her neck and ended her life. With the plotters still at large, Nero redoubled his guard and unleashed a reign of terror. Countless people, some innocent, some guilty, were sucked into the fury of Nero's revenge. Seneca was one of them. On meager evidence, the emperor sent an officer to demand the philosopher's suicide.
Seneca embraced his wife and gently begged her to live and temper her grief, but she chose to die with him. With a single stroke of the blade, they sliced their arms. Seneca, hardened by frugal living, did not bleed easily. He cut the veins of his knees and thighs, but still he did not die. He asked his doctor to dispense some poison hemlock. He drank it in vain. Finally, he was carried into the baths, where he suffocated in vapor.
Few philosophers had reached such powerful heights. Few paid so dearly. Seneca's actions fell short of his ideals, but history, he hoped, would judge him well.
The man who considers his generation alone is born for few. Many thousands of years and people will come after him. Look to these. If virtue brings fame, our reputation will survive. Posterity will judge without malice and honor our memory.
As Seneca's lifeblood drained away, the wicked were left ruling Rome, alone. While Rome was besieged by its own ruler, The empire's distant subjects were once again chafing under Roman rule. This time in the province of Judea. After 70 years of subjugation, the region was slipping into chaos. Bandits prowled the countryside, and Jewish terrorists began attacking people who collaborated with Rome. People like Josephus, a wealthy Jewish priest who feared for his life.
These criminals would kill men in broad daylight in the middle of the city. Especially during festivals, they would mingle in the crowd, hiding small daggers under their clothes and using them to stab their enemies. Many were killed each day, and terror stalked the city.
Judea was one spark away from revolt. That spark came in the year 66. Someone emptied a chamber pot outside a synagogue, defiling the holy site. The Jews were outraged. Rioting erupted. During the melee, some Jews shouted insults at the Roman governor, a man named Florus. Enraged, Florus pulled Jewish leaders before a tribunal. It was a pivotal moment in Josephus's life and in the lives of others struggling between cooperation with Rome and their Jewish heritage.
Florus demanded the Jewish leaders hand over the hecklers. The men refused, insisting they could not identify the guilty from the innocent. Florus, they said, should pardon the unknown scoundrels for the sake of the whole city. Provoked even more by this impudent speech, Florus shouted to the soldiers to plunder the market and to kill all they saw. Even prominent citizens were taken to Florus, who had them whipped and crucified.
Florus conducted a wholesale massacre in the streets of Jerusalem. And the brutality and viciousness reached a point where Josephus himself, or so he tells us, that Josephus decided that under these circumstances, there's no way that he could do anything other than take up his post as a leader of the Jews.
Within months, the former priest was leading a full-scale Jewish rebellion and confronting a battle-tested Roman army as it swept across his homeland. From one end of Galilee to the other, Josephus recounted, there was an orgy of fire and bloodshed. Eventually, Josephus and his beleaguered troops took refuge within the walled city of Jotapata. The Romans surrounded it. On the 47th day, just before dawn, Roman soldiers scaled the city's high walls. While the Jews slept, Roman troops streamed into the city. 40,000 Jews were killed. Josephus and 40 others fled to a concealed cave. There was no escape, and choosing death over surrender, his followers prepared to kill themselves. But Josephus argued that Jewish law prohibited suicide.
Trusting God, I staked my life on a fateful gamble. Since we expect to die, I said, let us draw lots and assign our deaths to each other. He who draws the first shard will fall by the hand of the next, and so on. In this way, no one will kill himself. My listeners were convinced, and I drew with the rest. Each died in turn. Soon, whether by chance or God's will, I was left with only one man. And eager to avoid the fate of the lottery, I persuaded him to stay alive.
Josephus tells us this story. You would think that it would be embarrassing, humiliating, and utterly self-destructive in a way to tell this story. Why does he tell it? I don't think anybody has come up with an adequate explanation of Josephus' psyche here. I mean, one can talk about guilt feelings and so on. There may be a much simpler explanation, namely that he got out of the siege of Jotapata alive when nobody else did. I think it was a source of considerable hostility to the Jews. So he needed to come up with some explanation.
The explanation took shape just hours later. When Josephus emerged from the cave, he was brought before Vespasian, the victorious Roman general. Josephus was sure to face death or slavery. But his guile did not desert him. Jewish prophets had predicted that a new world leader would emerge from the east. Josephus declared that Vespasian was that man. Bemused, Vespasian let Josephus live. But as the Roman army prepared for its final attack, events in Rome brought the campaign to an abrupt halt, and the imperial household to a frenzy of panic. Nero's biographer reports that the emperor's reign of terror had finally gone too far, and in the year 68, Josephus's prediction was becoming reality. Nero was losing his grip.
Having endured such a tempestuous emperor for almost 14 years, the world at last dismissed him. The uprising began in the northern territories.
Nero had tried to purge the ranks of the military. Armies from 2 provinces rebelled and began to march towards the capital.
When Nero learned of the revolt, he collapsed and lay on the floor, stunned and deathly silent. When word reached him that other armies had also defected, he tore up the dispatches and tried to enlist his officers to flee with him. Some turned their backs, and others openly refused.
Senators also turned on Nero. They declared him a public enemy, permitting him to be killed with impunity. Terrified, the emperor fled to the country with his few remaining slaves.
Although he was barefoot and wearing only a tunic, he grabbed a hooded cloak and galloped away to an old villa. While waiting for servants to prepare a secret entrance, he cleaned his torn cloak of thorns, then crawled in. He ordered them to dig his own grave. Weeping as he spoke, he moaned over and over, "Such an artist dies in me." With the help of his secretary, he drove an iron blade into his throat.
The dynasty of Augustus was extinct. The empire was rudderless. As the year 68 drew to a close, rival generals began marching towards the capital. Civil war closed in on Rome.
My mind trembles to remember, but I will begin. The earth had been shaking for many days. We weren't very frightened because that's common here. But by night, the tremors had grown so strong that everything shook and fell.
In the twilight of the 1st century, the Roman Empire shook to its foundations.
The buildings around trembled with such force that we were sure to die if we stayed. As we fled, I took my mother's hand. The sea swallowed itself and then hurled back a huge wave. You could hear women wailing, babies bawling, and men shouting. A few were so afraid of death, they prayed it would come soon.
The author would survive the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, but other disasters would rock his life, and the lives of millions around the empire. For as the 1st century passed its midpoint, civil war would be unleashed, and despotism would once again stalk the capital city. Many wondered if Rome would collapse after a century of glory, if the years of eruption would destroy the Roman Empire in the 1st century. As the year 68 unfolded, the city of Rome was approaching a century of unbroken peace. Prosperity reigned, and dangerous times seemed buried in history as people pursued lives of comfortable routine. They rose at dawn and prepared to make or receive morning visits. Women used cosmetics of mineral and ash and imported perfumes. The more affluent dressed in dazzling colors, wore fine jewelry, and elaborate hairstyles. Fashion required men be clean-shaven, but according to one ancient humorist, the tools of the day made fashion a painful pursuit.
These scars on my chin make me look like an old boxer. They were not made by my wife in a fit of anger, but by the criminal hand and evil razor of my barber. The billy goat is the only animal to have the courage to wear a beard and avoid the blade.
Such peaceful vanities, however, were swept aside in 68 AD, the year the Emperor Nero was overthrown. And with him, the dynasty that had ruled Rome for a century. The revolt had begun in Gaul and spread quickly to Spain. The imperial army posted there rose up and marched toward Rome. Nero committed suicide. The empire echoed with the fury of civil war. Generals worldwide wondered if they too should enter the fray. In the province of Judea, one man was already hardened by battle. His name was Vespasian, and he was one of the empire's most successful generals. For 3 years, Vespasian had been fighting to suppress a local revolt. With victory in sight, Vespasian's ambitions suddenly turned in directions unprecedented for a man of his station.
Vespasian was not from the old aristocracy. His family comes from a small town not very far from Rome, but a world away in social class. His father and grandfather had been tax collectors and soldiers, and he himself liked to put on the image of a man of the people. a man of the camp, a man who is one with his soldiers.
Vespasian's troops urged him to seize power. Soldiers in other provinces backed him too. Emboldened by the opportunity, Vespasian directed them to march on the capital. Vespasian's advanced troops began in the Balkans. They rounded the Adriatic Sea and descended on Rome. Upon reaching Italy, they found themselves face to face with the enemy. And for the first time in 100 years, the enemy were fellow Romans. The historian Cassius Dio describes the tragedy.
They fought as if against foreigners and not kinsmen. Even when night fell, they would not relent. But whenever the moon broke through the shifting clouds, you could see exhausted opponents talking. While over here some battled on, over there others rested, leaning on their swords. Occasionally one would take another aside and say, "Fellow soldier, citizen, what are we doing? Why are we fighting? Defect to my side." The other would reply, "No, indeed, you come to mine." And so they spent the night alternately fighting and talking until sunrise.
In the morning, Vespasian's forces gained the upper hand. They cut down their countrymen, ransacked a nearby town, and inflamed by blood and plunder, they closed on Rome. Soon the empire's capital was a battleground for competing armies, and Rome's civilians were caught in the middle.
The city of Rome was under siege, and the inhabitants were fighting, or fleeing, or even joining the looting, hoping that they may be taken for invaders and save their lives.
Some 50,000 were killed. Vespasian's forces won the day, and the feeble Senate ratified the result. Vespasian, a rustic man of the camp, was now emperor of Rome.
The Civil War revealed the dirty secret of the empire, that power really rested on military force. Anyone who had sufficient military might at his back could make a run at the imperial throne. And any emperor in the future would have to bear that in mind.
Rome was now a military dictatorship, and the empire's citizens braced for an uncertain future.
Greetings, my friend. I write to you in deepest sadness. The younger daughter of our mutual friend, Fundanus, has died.
Pliny the Younger was a witness to his age. His letters, published during his lifetime, show Pliny striving to reconcile with turbulent times in his public and private life.
I've never seen a girl more cheerful and friendly, more worthy of long life. Barely 14, she blended virginal modesty with the wisdom and dignity of a mature woman. And her early death was all the more tragic, since she was soon to marry a fine young man. The day had been chosen and the invitation sent. Such joy has turned to such sorrow.
Pliny was just a child during Rome's civil wars. He was born into a wealthy family from the countryside of northern Italy. Far from the capital, he was spared the immediate violence of war, but he was not spared personal tragedy. His own father died while young Pliny was still a boy. It was a life-changing blow. but it was hardly unusual. Apart from the hazards of war, many Romans died young from infectious disease, famine, and women from childbirth. Funerals and mourning were painful staples of daily life, and ancient monuments immortalize the timeless emotion of loss.
Here I'm laid to rest. I lived 27 years and was married for 16. I was a faithful wife who gave birth to 6 children. Only one survives me.
To my most beloved wife, who lived with me for 18 years and gave me no cause for complaint. But now I complain, and I beg you, spirits, to return my wife to me, that I may not experience such criminal separation any longer.
These were laments young Pliny could easily understand, for the events of Pliny's childhood taught him early and well that life was fleeting. Fame, he concluded, was the only tonic. By chronicling his times, Pliny hoped he might shape the empire's legacy and write his own.
Death seems bitter and premature for those composing timeless works. My own mortality, my own writings come to mind. No doubt the same thoughts frighten you. While life is with us, we must struggle to make our mark, so that death finds little it can wipe away.
While Pliny confronted the precarious nature of first-century life, the new Emperor Vespasian was in Egypt, confronting the realities of late-century politics. His troops controlled Rome, but Vespasian knew that Egypt was a key to supremacy. He needed to control Rome's food supply, the grain growing along the Nile. He needed to control the armies stationed there. And he needed the aura of grandeur that Egyptian culture readily supplied.
The unexpected and still new emperor lacked authority and majesty, but both these traits were offered to him.
The biographer Suetonius recalled the new emperor's awkward first steps towards a new persona.
As Vespasian held court before a large audience, 2 men approached. They begged Vespasian to cure their afflictions. They told him a dream had predicted that sight would return if Vespasian spit in the blind man's eyes, that the other would walk if Vespasian's heel touched his lame leg. The emperor was dubious and at first refused, but his friends persuaded him to try, openly, before the crowd. To Vespasian's amazement, the invalids were cured.
All emperors needed legitimacy, they needed authority, they needed some sign that their power came from outside, had the will of the gods behind it. And it's very common to have miracle-type stories hovering around emperors. Vespasian particularly, because he comes to power from nowhere. He's not part of the reigning dynasty. He needs these signs of authority.
Vespasian embraced his newfound stature, but he knew image alone could not hold the empire together, that his real power came from the military, and nothing would cement it more surely than a foreign victory. Vespasian fast returned his attention to Judea, to the province he left in haste the year before. Judea was still aflame. For 5 long years, the Jewish population had been waging a full-scale war of independence against Rome. The revolt showed stunning audacity and brought staggering costs. By the year 70, Roman forces had reduced much of Judea to smoldering ruins. The Jewish army had been decimated, and the few surviving rebels were now besieged inside the walled city of Jerusalem, with one notable exception. His name was Josephus.
Josephus was a Jewish aristocrat. He was educated as a Pharisee. He was very much a freedom fighter for his people and a military leader. But he became convinced, or perhaps convinced himself, that God was on the Roman side in this battle, in this war.
Just months before, Josephus had been a rebel fighter, but he had been captured and changed sides. Now he operated freely in the Roman camp outside Jerusalem's walls, and he offered useful information to the invading army. Josephus's former allies, even his own family, were still besieged inside the city. But on the Romans' behalf, Josephus now urged his fellow Jews to surrender.
I circled the wall. I begged them to spare themselves, their country, and their temple. They knew Roman strength was irresistible. What land had escaped the Romans? Fortune's favor had turned to Rome, and God was now in Italy. You stubborn men! Throw down your weapons and pity your collapsing city. My family is trapped inside with you. Perhaps you think that's why I urge surrender, but kill them. Take my blood as the price for your salvation. I too am ready to die if that will teach you sense.
The defenders ignored his appeal. The Roman noose continued to tighten. Roman soldiers stripped the countryside of trees for miles around. They built a giant siege tower to scale the Jewish fortress. But supply tunnels dug by the rebels had weakened Jerusalem's walls. To the amazement of all, one of them suddenly collapsed. And the astonished Romans flooded in. Romans and Jews fought face to face through the narrow, winding streets. Soon the surviving Jews were driven back into their last bastion, the walled sanctuary of Jerusalem's sacred temple, deep inside the city.
The temple was the symbol of the faith, and not just for the Jews who happened to live in Jerusalem. This was true of the Jews all over the Mediterranean, most of whom had never been to Jerusalem, had never seen the temple, but for whom it was the emblem of continuity of Judaism.
However sacred, the walls of the temple could not withstand the onslaught. A Roman soldier flung some burning wood into the temple grounds. Immediately, the temple burst into flames, and Roman troops invaded. Josephus witnessed the massacre.
Passion alone took charge. Flight and death were everywhere. Most of those killed were unarmed citizens, butchered wherever they were caught. Around the holy altar, corpses piled up and slid in a river of blood down the steps. The cries of the stricken spread everywhere. I can imagine nothing more horrifying than those cries.
The rebellion was broken. Thousands died. But for many Jews, the fate of the temple was even more devastating than the human carnage. With no place to conduct their timeless rituals, the Jews of Jerusalem braced for the extinction of their religion. But Judaism would not die. Jews outside Jerusalem would keep their practices and memories alive. Ironically, one of them was Josephus. The rebel collaborator followed the conquering army back to Rome, even became a Roman citizen. But he did not abandon his heritage. Perhaps to ease his conscience, Josephus would dedicate his remaining life to recording the events he had witnessed. He would become one of the great chroniclers of Jewish history.
Recently, I have spent all my time among writing tablets and books. How is that possible with the races on, you ask? They're not the kind of spectacle I find tempting. I marvel that thousands are so childish and long to see again and again galloping horses pulling men standing in chariots.
While Judea burned, the empire's capital returned to the rhythms of peace, and Pliny to the rhythms of a young Roman gentleman. Pliny and his widowed mother had moved to Rome. Only the capital, his family decided, could provide the boy a suitable education. But writing later, the bookish newcomer found Rome a city of contrasts, both richly endowed and wasteful with its culture.
This year has produced a great crop of poets, despite the reluctance of the public to come and listen. People say that in our parents' day, things were different. Once, the Emperor Claudius was walking on a rare break from work when he learned that a poetry reading was in progress. So great was his love of letters that unexpectedly he joined the audience. But today, even men with ample leisure neglect the arts.
The lost refinement that Pliny mourned may have been more imagined than real, but Rome had changed over the course of the 1st century. Many old families had died out, and new ones, such as Pliny's own, were rising to prominence. Foreigners also enjoyed growing influence, and their cultures left a strong mark on Rome. New religions, such as the worship of Isis and Mithras, were absorbed from the East, and philosophy from Greece.
The Romans were not cultural imperialists who came in and said, you've got to do just like we are doing. Quite the opposite. They gave a lot of freedom. It is not simply Rome coming in, laying things down from the top. The local cultures are being given the opportunity to make their own contributions in many different ways.
Rome's willingness to embrace cultures not its own was one key to the empire's strength. But for some, it was also profoundly unsettling. Towards the end of the 1st century, a man named Juvenal wrote scathing satire, voicing the frustrations of many Romans. Few groups escaped Juvenal's poison pen.
Now let me say something about that race that most appalls me. I just can't stand our city full of Greeks. For too long now, the East has dumped this scum into our beloved Tiber, carrying with them their language and habits, their flutes and ridiculous stringed instruments. What a travesty. Foreigners just blown into Rome get a better deal than I do. I, who drew my first breath in the city.
With Juvenal, what you've got is a satirist who will fire at any target that moves. But in firing, he creates a consistent figure for himself. And the figure is of a good Roman, what a Roman really ought to be, in a city where everything is going wrong, where Rome has ceased to be Roman, where it's flooded with immigrants. Juvenal is the voice of the old-fashioned Roman protesting about the way the world is changing around him.
Really aggravating is that woman who sits down at a dinner party and immediately starts holding forth, weighing the merits of Virgil against Homer. Words spew from her mouth, clattering like pots and pans. Lawyers and vendors and even other women dare not speak. Such matters are men's concerns.
Juvenal's bitterness was not universal. Indeed, as the century entered its final decades, most Romans were enjoying a surge of optimism, a sense that the empire was back on course. Now, with Jerusalem conquered, the capital was marking its first foreign victory in years. The former rebel Josephus was there.
That day, the city of Rome celebrated the victory over her enemies, the end of civil war, and the beginning of hope for a prosperous future. In the procession, spoils of war flowed like a river of gold, silver, and ivory, fashioned into all forms. Marvelous statues of the gods were carried, huge and made with great skill, and there were creatures of many lands. But what stood out above the rest were those objects captured in the Temple of Jerusalem.
Josephus well understood that this was a pivotal moment. It symbolized the revival of an empire traumatized by civil war, the mending of Rome's frayed society, and the unassailable authority of the new emperor, Vespasian. Vespasian restored the war-torn capital. He built temples, a theater, and began a massive amphitheater later called the Colosseum. But Vespasian also constructed something less tangible. He constructed a fresh image for the position of emperor.
Vespasian was almost always in high spirits. His sense of humor often scurrilous and off-color. Once, his son Titus scolded the emperor for his unseemly new tax on public toilets. Vespasian held a coin up to his son's nose and asked whether the odor caused offense. And when Titus denied it, Vespasian said, "But it comes from piss."
Vespasian approached the business of government with an earthy humor and common sense rarely shown by his predecessors. He was frugal, expenditures were financed by new taxes, and he was approachable.
Vespasian was stocky, with strong, firm limbs and a strained expression. Once, when Vespasian invited a local wit to take a jab at him, the man replied, "I will, when you have finished unloading your bowels."
The emperor roared with laughter, and the empire sighed with relief. For after decades of abuse and uncertainty, Vespasian became much more than a conquering general. He became the empire's hope for stability.
Vespasian, an adventurer in politics, was able to found a new dynasty, and he held on to power for 10 years. Against the odds, one might say. He was able to restore the stability that Augustus had first introduced many decades earlier.
All of Rome benefited by Vespasian's steady hand, but for young Pliny, the unconventional emperor opened the world. He was not yet a teenager when Vespasian took control, and for the next decade of his life, Rome would be an exhilarating place to live. Pliny studied with famous teachers, particularly his uncle, a man born far from the center of power, whose prodigious talents brought him to the attention of the emperor and into the inner circle of imperial advisors. Pliny's uncle was an accomplished scholar and a prolific author. He compiled a 37-volume encyclopedia on the natural world. His writings covered everything from marine life to planetary motions and provide a unique glimpse into the world view of ancient Rome.
An octopus, when he fears capture, emits a dark ink, which he has instead of blood, and is able to conceal himself in the darkened water. The whole world is divided into 3 continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. When bees die, some think they can be brought back to life by covering them with the stomach of a newly killed cow.
"We are now in such a happy time of peace," the elder Pliny wrote, "under an emperor who welcomes the pursuit of research and writing." Young Pliny was deeply impressed by his uncle's exhaustive curiosity and exhausting efforts. Industry and proficiency, the boy observed, paved the road to success and made his revered uncle a celebrated figure.
You marvel how my uncle could have written so many volumes when he was so busy. His enthusiasm was unbelievable, and he would rise before the sun to pursue his studies by lamplight. Sometimes while working, he would nod off and wake again. Still before dawn, he would go to the Emperor Vespasian, who also worked at night, and only then start his professional duties.
Vespasian rewarded Pliny's uncle with important posts in Spain, Gaul, Africa, and the boy rejoiced when the elder returned to Italy to command the Roman fleet. But in the year 79, a shadow fell across young Pliny's path. After ruling for a decade, the family patron, the Emperor Vespasian, became gravely ill. The emperor knew he was dying, but his humor remained to the end. "Oh dear," he quipped, mocking Rome's habit of deifying dead emperors, "I think I'm becoming a god." Vespasian had brought Rome through the gravest crisis of the century, civil war, and left the empire stronger and more resilient than ever. But Vespasian passed on a troubled legacy, too. "My sons will succeed me," he declared openly, "or no one will." The empire was still plagued by the scourge of hereditary rule. Vespasian had done nothing to change that.
And so the day came. The people had already gathered for the spectacle of our punishment. And those who were about to die were forced to march through the arena.
Ritualized violence had been a favorite entertainment of the Roman populace for centuries. Criminals, slaves, and war captives were often sent to the arena, where they fought to the death before roaring crowds.
All around I could hear the instruments of death. I could hear the sound of a blade being sharpened, of metal weapons heating in the fire, the clatter of sticks, the cracking of whips. The trumpets sounded the death knell. Stretchers for the dead were brought on, a funeral parade before death. Everywhere there were wounded men, groans, gore. Nothing but danger before my eyes.
We have to recognize that the Romans actually enjoyed the spectacle of seeing people die. This is one of the fundamental characteristics of Rome. They were a militaristic society from their very beginnings, and when they saw gladiatorial combats, they were seeing in many ways a symbol of their own martial prowess and enjoying the bloodlust that was always part of the national character.
While most had no choice, some volunteered to enter the arena. Ancient graffiti hint at the attraction.
The gladiator called Caladus is the heartthrob of all the girls.
Creskins, who fights with a net and snares his female fans.
In many ways, gladiators were like movie stars today. They could achieve great fame, great success, and become extremely wealthy. There was almost a show business atmosphere to what went on there, and the desire for popularity certainly must have impelled many gladiators to go out into the amphitheater and fight despite all the risks that were involved.
Sutius Certus presents a band of gladiators to fight in Pompeii on May 31st. Shade will be provided.
In the summer of 79, the city of Pompeii was a thriving community of some 10,000 people. Many are known to us, thanks to a twist of fate that preserved their world for 2,000 years. Like most Roman cities, Pompeii boasted a stadium, theaters, temples, public baths, and shops. On any given day, the residents of Pompeii ate, drank, and socialized in the cafes and taverns that lined the streets.
Here, a decent drink costs a few coins. Twice that buys something better. And for 4 times the price, you can savor the best wine.
The wine may have been supplied by Pompeii's Vettii brothers. Former slaves, they entered the wine trade and prospered. Their home was large and elegant, radiating signs of newly acquired wealth. This couple is thought to have owned a bakery. They posed for their portrait, holding symbols of education and status. Across town lived a woman named Julia Felix, a wealthy landowner who rented real estate on the grounds of her expansive villa.
On the estate of Julia Felix, the following are for rent: luxurious baths, shops, cafes, workspaces, and second-story apartments.
And then there was Eumachia, a woman of wealth and authority, so esteemed for her contributions to Pompeii's civic life that a statue was erected in her honor. These people, and countless others, rich and poor, lived and flourished in the region. Ancient graffiti revealed the vitality of their everyday lives.
A copper pot has vanished from this shop. Whoever returns it, the reward is yours.
Pompeian graffiti are wonderful because they give a sort of unedited voice, an informal voice, when we're so used to hearing from antiquity those very formal voices of formal literature or imperial pronouncements or so on. You go into a bar and you find this little inscription about the barkeeper's daughter.
Sagessus the weaver loves the handmaiden Iris, who does not care for him, but he begs her to pity him.
And then written in another hand beneath, "Ha, so says the jealous rival, eat your heart out."
You're bursting with jealousy. I wish you wouldn't harass the handsomer man, the one who is the most noble.
I have said this to you, and now I have written, you love Iris, who doesn't care for you.
Such rivalries would all be forgotten on the afternoon of August 24th. On that day, Pliny the Younger, now 17 years old, was vacationing with his mother on the Bay of Naples, across the water from Pompeii. His uncle had come down from Rome on naval business. Suddenly, an unusual cloud appeared in the sky above Mount Vesuvius.
The cloud was shaped like an umbrella pie, with a long trunk that branched at the top. It was so remarkable, my uncle wanted to study it closer. He ordered a boat to be prepared. Fearlessly, he headed across the bay, straight for danger, all the while making notes of the movements and shapes of the clouds. Soon ashes were falling, hot and dense. Next came pumice stones, black and scorched by fire. He came ashore near his friend's villa, and hoping to calm him by his own composure, my uncle asked to bathe and rest. Soon the courtyard outside his room filled with ash. The building swayed with heavy tremors. The sky turned blacker than night. Then flames and sulfur fumes sent everyone into flight. He asked for water, then stood up and suddenly collapsed, his breath choked by the thickening fog. Daylight came 3 days later.
The young Pliny survived, but his uncle, Pliny the Elder, felled by his own curiosity, was one of thousands who perished. Pompeii and the nearby city of Herculaneum were buried in a torrent of ash and mud and lost to history for the next 1,600 years.
We hired a porter called Corax, who turned out to be more trouble than help. He often dropped his load, complaining about the pace and griping. "What do you think I am, a horse? I am no less free than you, even if my father left me a pauper." Not content with cursing us, he lifted his foot and filled the air with the noise and stench of his fart.
The people who toiled to earn their living rarely wrote about their lives. The vibrant mass of porters, cooks, builders, and merchants was mostly illiterate. Even those who could write had little time to reflect. Instead, we hear of them through the voices of their patrons, men whose ancestral fortunes often freed them from the need to work.
Some trades are too coarse and vulgar for a gentleman. We disdain customs officers and moneylenders. Also beneath us are all occupations requiring labor alone without skill. They are no better than slavery.
Even less vocal were the throngs of slaves who kept the empire running. They worked everywhere, in Roman mines, fields, and households. Many came as war captives. Others were born into bondage. And while the ancient institution festered with the same abuses seen later in history, in the Roman Empire, it had a different complexion.
Slavery was not based on race. In fact, it was what you could call an equal opportunity condition. Anyone was liable to become a slave at any time, and in fact, the biggest difference between ancient forms of slavery and modern forms of slavery is this absence of a sharp color contrast.
Roman slaves merged so well into the population that the Senate once considered a plan to distinguish them by special dress. The idea was rejected. If slaves saw how numerous they were, the Senate decided, they might be emboldened to rebel. Pliny the Younger was no stranger to slavery. His family owned a large country estate, several homes, and like most affluent Romans, many slaves. While secure that full-scale revolts were rare, Pliny knew well that discontent simmered beneath the surface.
I must tell you what has happened. The atrocity Larcius Macedo suffered at the hands of his slaves deserves public outrage. He was washing in his bathhouse. Suddenly, his servants surrounded him. One grabbed his throat, others beat him, and, it sickens me to say, they even crushed his genitals. You can see what danger of violence, what outrageous contempt we live under. He was an arrogant and cruel master, but there is no security for anyone, not even those who are lenient and gentle. For slaves kill not to bring justice to their master, but from their criminal nature.
For Pliny, and for the ancients in general, slavery was just part of the natural order of things. When it was rationalized, It could be rationalized quite simply in terms of the natural superiority and inferiority that's built into nature.
In such an ordered society, landed gentry, such as the family of Pliny the Younger, had rich prospects. At age 18, after inheriting his uncle's fortune, young Pliny set out to follow his elder's footsteps. He launched a career in law and politics. But while his uncle had flourished under a good emperor, the younger man would seek his fame and fortune under very different circumstances. In the year 81, Vespasian's youngest son ascended to power. His name was Domitian, and as the biographer Suetonius recounts, he would prove to be as terrible a tyrant as any who came before.
Early in his rule, he would seclude himself for hours, catching flies and sticking them with sharpened pens, so that once, when someone asked whether anyone was inside with the emperor, a palace wit cleverly replied, "Not even a fly." Domitian's savagery was unexpected. He once called a steward into his bedroom to dine. The next day, the man was crucified.
Domitian indulged mercurial whims. He launched treason trials and executed or banished even his mildest critics. He terrorized the Roman elite and presented Pliny the Younger with the greatest challenge of his life: how to navigate treacherous times without compromising his values, how to maintain honor while climbing the ranks of a despotic system. Pliny admired, even befriended those who balked at Domitian's rule. But the martyr's path was not for him. Instead, Pliny staked his morality on a ground of compromise, befitting his compromised times. He was efficient and dutiful to friend and tyrant alike. Even while serving the emperor, he brokered marriages for the children of worthy exiles, promoted their careers, lent money. And through it all, Pliny's career thrived, but his success was tinged with remorse.
I have avoided shame, but deserve no praise. Admittedly, when Domitian expelled his critics from Rome, I visited one, even loaned him money, though this jeopardized my own position. 7 of my friends had already been killed or exiled. I was clearly standing amid a rain of thunderbolts, and there were signs that a similar end was in store for me.
The fact remains that Pliny the Younger was a very successful career politician, and he prospered under Domitian, as did many of his social class. And what I think we can see going on here is a recognition on the part of upper-class individuals like Pliny that it was perfectly possible for them to collaborate with a political system that provided good government, even if the emperor of the day was an absolute tyrant.
Pliny, like the empire itself, would outlast the troubling times. In the year 96, Rome once again shed its despot. Domitian was murdered by a group that included his own wife. And once again, the army would command Rome's future. From here, events followed a remarkable new course. For the first time, Roman generals cooperated to choose the next emperor, and they compelled him to adopt an acceptable heir from outside his own family. It was startlingly innovative, and the result was resoundingly successful. For the next major emperor to rule Rome was a Spanish-born senator and general named Trajan. His reign took Rome one more step toward universality. Now, educated and wealthy men from all over the empire became eligible for the highest office. Trajan expanded the Roman Empire to its greatest geographic size. He extended prosperity to levels of society not before reached. He launched public works, tax relief, a child welfare program, and among his most trusted aides was Pliny the Younger. As the century turned, Pliny now reveled in the benefits of success and publicly praised the new emperor, Trajan.
We are suffering no longer. There is no need to flatter him as a god. We speak not about a tyrant, but a fellow citizen, not a master, but a parent. He is one of us, and remembers that though he rules over men, he is himself a man.
Trajan would close the door on the empire's defining epic. He would set the course for generations to come and project the collective voice of the first century across 2 millennia where it resonates today.
Europe today draws on the power of an image created by the Roman Empire. Rome takes the cultural systems developed initially in the Eastern Mediterranean and spreads them in a dramatic way and lays the foundations of a whole cultural zone that is our modern Europe.
The first century provided us with a powerful model for a global society consisting of people from different ethnicities and different cultures who were able to unite on certain fronts and remain distinct and separate in others.
In the first century, we see in the midst, in the very teeth of the most powerful system of imperial domination that the world had ever seen up to that time. See, right in the midst of that, the fluorescence of a notion of human freedom that grows up like a lotus out of the mud pond of Roman domination.
All around us, how much things have changed. My work brought me success, then danger, then success again.
Towards the end of his life, Pliny the Younger prepared to enter history as a spokesperson for his age. Few had basked longer in the might and majesty of imperial Rome. Few knew better its darker side. But Pliny's perspective was long, and like those who came before, he trusted that his better side would endure.
Whether posterity will remember us, I do not know. But we certainly deserve distinction. Not for our genius, for this would sound arrogant, but for our dedication, labor, and concern for the future. We will continue on the road that we have taken, which, while it carries few into the full light of fame, leads many from the shadows of oblivion.
The Roman Empire would survive for centuries to come. But the men and women of the first century left a legacy for the ages, deserving forever the full light of fame.